Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Pre-Colonial and Colonial Philippines-China History Conference, organized by the Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University. Before we proceed with our afternoon session, I would like to remind our participants again that the conference is being recorded and live streamed on the Ateneo Confucius Facebook page for public viewing. Participants will be muted throughout the conference, and due to time constraints, questions will be accommodated through Google Forms and will be answered via email after the conference. The Google Form link will be available in the chat box, and answers will be posted publicly on all Ateneo Confucius Institute social media platforms. Each paper is allotted 50 minutes for presentation and discussion by the discussants, and presenters will have 25 minutes for the presentation, while discussants have 10 minutes each to give their comments. The remaining 5 minutes is for any reply or clarification that the presenter may have. We will now proceed with the paper presentation for the afternoon session. May we invite our moderator, Ms. Stephanie Tan, to introduce our presenter and discussants.
Thank you, Sophia. So the first paper this afternoon is authored by Ms. Rhina Boncocan. Ms. Rhina Alvero Boncocan is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Social Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences, University of the Philippines, Los Baños. She's a graduate of BA History and Master in Philippine Studies at UP Diliman. She was also a former chairperson of the Department of Social Sciences, CAS, UPLB. Her paper will be presented by Mr. Kristian Sulmayor. For this session, the discussants are Ms. Teresita Ang See, a social activist who has worked for social cohesion and integration of the ethnic Chinese minority into mainstream Philippine society. She is the founding president of Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran and now serves as the executive trustee of the Kaisa Heritage Center that houses Bahay Chinoy, the Museum of the Chinese in the Philippine Life. She has authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited 21 books on Chinese in the Philippines and Philippine-China relations. The second discussant is Dr. Jely Galang. Jely Galang is an assistant professor of history at UP Diliman. His research interests include the 19th century Philippines, Chinese in Southeast Asia, and history of crime and punishment. He is currently working on a paper about Sino-M'ranistas or Cantonese Chinese in 19th century Philippines. Let us welcome Mr. Kristian Sulmayor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that, Ms. Steph. On behalf of Professor Rhina Boncocan, I'll be presenting her paper entitled Tracing Maranao-Chinese Relations Through Archival Resources. And I'd like to say good afternoon to all of our viewers here in Zoom and even to our discussants, Professor Teresita Ang See and Dr. Jely Galang. I'll be sharing my screen. Okay, so once again, this is the title of the paper of Professor Boncocan of the UP Los Baños, Tracing Chinese Maranao Relations Through Archival Resources, focus on the Chinese in Misamis from 1850 to 1890. With the outline of the paper, there are notes on early contacts with the Chinese in Mindanao, the Spanish control in Misamis, the 19th century Spanish policies toward the Chinese, and the profile of Chinese in Misamis. This paper aimed to probe whether there were direct and indirect Chinese relations with Maranaos before and during Spanish control of Mindanao in the latter half of the 19th century. Focus on Misamis because Lanao, homeland of the Maranaos, was included in Misamis province during the period of Spanish control over Mindanao. And also, there's a profile describing the Chinese who settled in Misamis in towns of northern Mindanao was prepared. We tried to utilize archival sources in Manila to verify presence of Chinese in areas near Maranao homeland in Misamis province. Primary and secondary sources from various archives and libraries, such as the National Archives of the Philippines, the Recollect Archives, and the UP Library and the UST Archives, as well as the online libraries and archives. Sources are limited, or the access to the sources becomes limited because of this restriction on access due to the pandemic, which caused or the reason why there is this limited um, um, data being collected. So apparently only 50% of existing manuscripts were allowed by the National Archives of the Philippines for the research. There are also early commercial relations of Sulu, Maguindanao, Zamboanga, and Butuan with Chinese, where most documented. Not the case, however, with Maranaos. And whatever commercial relations between the Maranao and the Chinese were largely viewed as indirect and as mere consequence of internal trading activities between Maranaos and coastal trading centers of Sulu, Zamboanga, and Maguindanao. The presence of Chinese porcelain wares was the most important evidence of Chinese trade links with various islands in the archipelago. Very little documentation on direct trade relations or relations of any kind between Chinese and the Maranaos existed at this time. It also implies the interaction of Chinese with the Maranaos were rare and far between. In 15th century, Chinese merchants were again actively visiting and trading with most of coastal areas of archipelago, like Manila, Cebu, and Jolo, were large established centers. Jolo and Sulu traded pearls, pearl shells, and other sea products. The Sulu rulers visited the Ming port of China in 1417, according to Bayer of 1947. The Maranaos, however, being further inland, do not appear in records of this time or very rarely. One reference was known of 1993, who mentioned a, open quote, well-organized raid conducted by the pirates of Lubungan, end of quote, which involved a crew of about 2,000 that include both Maranaos and Chinese engineers. Part of Mindanao was controlled by Spanish government, with much of Mindanao population independent. Only 3 provinces were administered by Spaniards, the Caraga, the Misamis, and Zamboanga. Zamboanga covered only a fort or a presidio with a territory along the coast. Spanish goal was to establish a presidio which may serve as an outpost to control slave raiding in Mindanao, as well as a base to extend Spanish control over the island. Alongside military actions to reduce Mindanaoans, Spaniards pursued missions to extend Christianity to the island. First mission launched by Jesuits in 1596. Then the mission came under the jurisdiction of the Diocese of Cebu, according to Bernard. After transferring the mission to secular priests, this was eventually entrusted to the Augustinian Recollects. And under Governor General Alfonso Fajardo, Mindanao was assigned to the Recollects in March of 1621 through the Augustinian Bishop of Cebu, Pedro de Arce. Missionaries started evangelization in 1622. However, Buzeta of 1850 described Misamis as one of 4 political divisions of Mindanao after its reduction by the Spaniards, identified as an Alcadia Mayor. Noted the lack of development of towns, particularly the need to improve the towns, utilization of resources, also recommended the need to put up defenses against Moro enemies, as constant threat of piratical attacks prevented progress from taking place in the province. Reports of death and destruction due to Moro attacks in Misamis during the Spanish-Moro Wars. However, normal daily life may also be gleaned from reports. The town experienced growth and prosperity brought about by people's productivity in agriculture, in trading, and other industries. And in 1837, reports on produce of province, population counts of each towns, establishment of new towns, and request of separation of certain visitas from cabecera. 19th century, we're trying to look into the 19th century Spanish policies towards the Chinese. 19th century policy encouraged Chinese immigration, stemming from Spanish officials' need to develop agriculture, commerce, and industry. In 1834, there's an 1834 decree which allowed persons of any nationality to engage in trading and reside in the Philippines. Chinese restrictions on immigration and trade were lifted. Taxation regulations in 1832, 1837, and 1843, these changes to fix problem of arbitrary taxation and restrictions on occupation and mobility was also eased. In 1939, there's a decree favored settlement of Chinese in uncolonized areas, acting as penal colonies for Chinese who did not pay their taxes. And in 1848, the Chinese traveling to provinces had to obtain an internal passport from the colonial government, implying strict monitoring of Chinese travel to provinces. 1855 and 1860, there's an opening of provincial ports, Suwal, Pangasinan, Cebu, and Iloilo, to direct foreign trade. By 1863, there's foreign vessels appeared in Cebu with sugar and hemp. Also Cebu-based Chinese merchants ventured into northern Mindanao via Misamis. Now, the Chinese presence in Misamis, we have this Diaz Arenas in Memorias Históricas y Estadísticas. Misamis had the biggest number of Chinese settlers among all provinces in 1849. 562 Chinese radicados or residents from a total of 1,267 for all provinces. Boring's description of internal trade in Iligan between natives and Moros included Chinese wares. Open quote, some of the fairs in the interior are largely attended by the Mohammedan and heathen natives who will not visit the ports or larger towns. That of Iligan, which was in Misamis in Mindanao, is much visited by Moros who bring thither for sale paddy, cocoa, coffee, gold, dust, cotton, fabrics, creases, and weapons of war, with many other native articles, which they exchange mostly for European and Chinese wares. So you can see here a table. There's a survey of population counts by various authors showed a steady stream of Chinese presence in Misamis. In 1870, the province was comprised of 15 pueblos. We have Aluvid, which is now Alubihid, Balingasay, which is now Balingasag, Cagayan, Dapitan, Dipolog, Jimenez, Casaan, Lubungan, Misamis, Iligan, Ipunan, Catarman, Mahinog, Marabahaw, and Sugay, which is now and Sugay, according to the source Cavada. Most towns saw Chinese traders residing in their areas during the latter half of the 19th century. Talking about the Chinese commerce in Misamis, in 1890s, Chinese engaged in the local commercial activities of Misamis. In 1894 and 1896 to 1897, we have this Contribución Industrial. A Chinese shop owners paid most number of taxes were from businesses established in Locolan, Aloran, Iligan, Misamis, and Santa Ana, which is part of northern part of Lanao. Majority of Chinese owners, or 66%, were categorized under the Industria classification of Tarifa. They either applied for as especulador or speculator. Example, especulador de frutas y productos del país. Expendedor or vending, Example, expendedor de alcohol al por menor. The industria could have been quesado or to seize. Example, cesado la industria de helados y tejidos de alquiden empresas aprenda se venta de frutas con depósito desde día de hoy. O traspasado or to transfer. Example, traspasado la industria al chino tan tuaco de chino del mismo pueblo. So we have also involvement of Chinese in agriculture or agriculturas. Some Chinese in Misamis were identified as agriculturists or farmers. Si Songle, 29 years old, arrived in the Philippines in 1885 from Imoy or Amoy and resided in Misamis. Agriculturists were classified under the Clase de Cedula, which was designated for all adult males, not included in the first 5 classes, like the employees of the self-employed shop owners and professionals who occupied the first 5 tax classes. At least in the obtained padron data for Misamis, a great majority of the Chinese were identified in the 6, followed by the 4A and the 5A classes. So we have here, this table shows you that. Let's go to the profiling of Chinese in Misamis. Most Chinese were in their 20s when listed in the padron. Many were 29 years old. Each of the age range 31 to 40 and 41 to 50 composed 1/5 of the dataset population. Based on the percentage per range or per age range, the Chinese population in the Misamis province was relatively young during 1893 and 1895. The average age was 34. And the majority of Chinese came from Amoy, and almost 1/5 of the dataset population came from Tong'an. Chinese coming from Chincan, 8%, and 4% coming from Tianjin, and 3% coming from Nan'an. And Longxi, 1%, when combined comprise only less than 1/5 of the population, or 16%. All the areas indicated in the table were from ports in southern China in the Fujian province. In terms of their dates of arrival, beginning in 1862, handfuls of people arrived each year. One exception was in 1869 when 18 Chinese men arrived in the region. A wave of immigration to Misamis came in the 1880s, which was when most, or 55.3% of the people listed in the padron arrived. The year 1881 was the single year that saw the most arrivals with 21. 1/3 of the Chinese population in Misamis arrived in the 4-year period between 1883 and 1886. In terms of religion, the Chinese population was predominantly non-Christian. The Padron General de Chinos did not identify which religion these infidels adhered to. Galang noted that those who converted to Christianity can be identified by their sometimes exclusive use of Christian names. In terms of the Chinese civil status, the Chinese population in Misamis were overwhelmingly 96.2% single. Only 6 people were listed as married. No information was listed pertaining to who they were married to or where and when they married. It can be noted that all the men listed as married or casado were part of the Christian minority. Data of report coming from the Recollects in 1879. In 1879, the Recollects reported the count for the different profiles related to the evangelization work in the Estado de Almas de la Nación. They specified the presence of Chinese in 4 pueblos in Misamis province, classified into Chinos, Cristianos, Chinos, and Mestizos Sanglay. For Chinos, Hasaan, with cases of conversions, and Ipunan accounted for most numbers. Mestizos Sanglay were recorded in Alubihid, Misamis, and Mambahaw. The big number of non-Christians in the pueblos aforementioned is likewise notable, suggesting presence of groups and exchange with missionaries of converts coming from the mountains and Muslim Maranaos. As the Recollects were about to completely turn over their parishes to the Jesuits, Misamis remain to be one of the top 5 sources of religious tribute in the Philippines. Misamis follow the ranks of Bohol, Negros, Zambales, and Cavite, where dense population of Christians could be found, according to Paredes. This signified the considerable population in the area and existence of diverse social classes. In conclusion, this paper examined available Spanish archival records to probe whether there were possible direct and indirect Chinese relations with the Maranaos before and during the Spanish control of Mindanao in the latter half of the 19th century. The archival sources show the presence of Chinese in the Misamis province within the proximity of Maranao areas. There were Chinese traders, agriculturists, shop owners, and workers residing in the Misamis province during the latter half of the 19th century. A profile describing the Chinese who settled in Misamis near the Maranaos indicated their possible roles in the economic and social life in the area. These are the references used by Professor Boncocan. That's a reading for her paper. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sir Kristian. So for now, may I call on Ms. Teresita Ang See for her comments on the paper?
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you to the Confucius Institute for this invitation to be the discussant of Ms. Rhina Boncocan's paper on Maranao-Chinese relations. I really hope the Confucius Institute can continue these efforts to encourage young researchers to do research on still many unexplored areas on Philippines-China relations and the Chinese in the Philippines. Ms. Boncocan gave a good overview of the Muslims of Mindanao and the work she has done to trace Maranao-Chinese relations within the broad context of this history. The paper admittedly is thin on Maranao's Chinese narrative, and most archival sources used, including those cited from Dr. Jely Galang's dissertation, were dated mid to end 19th century. However, she cannot be faulted for that because there really are scant direct documentary sources on the early Chinese relations with the Maranaos. Hence, my suggestion to her before this afternoon's talk was to qualify the time period that she was using, which I saw that she did because the final paper did qualify that it is mid to end 19th century instead of just the broad tracing Maranao-Chinese relations through archival sources, which gave me high expectations that maybe she would be able to do some work on a lot of the early colonial era, which I thought was impossible and which she was able to prove in her paper. Her introduction actually gave us the rationale behind the scant documentation of early relations compared with the Chinese trade with Sulu, Maguindanao, Zamboanga, Butuan, mainly because the Maranaos are concentrated inland and commercial relations at best are indirect. This is actually true in all areas in the Philippines where early trade with the Chinese occurred. Rich artifacts like porcelain wares were uncovered mainly in coastal areas where Chinese sampans dock. Santa Ana in Manila, Bai in Laguna, mentioned as Mai in ancient Chinese records, Lingayen in Pangasinan, Vigan in Ilocos, Absari in Cagayan, are examples of treasure troves of early Chinese trade wares because trading and exchanges occurred mainly along the shorelines. The difference is Lake Lanao is a huge body of water, and though indirect trade occurred, it must be extensive because the Maranaos are also seafarers and could have easily used the waterways to navigate to the sea. I cite as an example Bai in Laguna, the first place mentioned in the Chinese Chinese annals as Mai, where trading took place in the 10th century. This trade from the shores of Bai Laguna extended further inland to various towns in Pila, San Pedro, Caliraya, up to nearby provinces of Quezon and Batangas. Remnants of strong Chinese cultural influence were found because the bodies of water connecting the lakes around Laguna serve as an important transport system. Which brings me to wonder if any of the researchers found this to be the case for the Maranaos. As maybe the paper on the archaeology this afternoon may lead to an answer to this. As the author said, Maranao-Chinese relations seem to be only a mere consequence of the internal trading activities between the Maranaos and the coastal trading centers of Sulu, Zamboanga, and Maguindanao, which directly engage with Chinese traders. I wonder if the archaeologists can extract more information or evidence of this to show that there is indeed extensive internal trading between the Chinese, the Maranaos, the Maguindanaons, and other Muslim groups, which I believe should be able to point to the answer that it's not just seem to be, but there really is a direct, indirect trading that happened between the Chinese and the Maranaos. The author mentioned that Maranao-Chinese relations in the late Song dynasty and before the arrival of Islam were limited to modern stories transported across faraway lands. This is generally true because Chinese sources in the pre-Song to early Song dynasties were focused mainly on bigger trading centers. But I'd like to point out that perhaps these stories could be an important source of information, as a earlier paper of Dr. Caballero pointed out. Little or scant documentation does not really mean that rare interactions occurred, or interactions occurred rarely. The indirect trade, I believe, is not a question, but it is the norm. The Lake Lanao itself is an important transport route that will be exploited by early Chinese traders who tied up the Philippine economy in the trilogy of the natives, the colonizers, and the Chinese, for trading not just with China, but with Southeast Asia. As Dr. Abinales said this morning, a rich source of information will be the Chinese traders who gathered raw materials and dried goods like forest and marine products from Pagadian, Iligan, Osamis to be sold to Visayas and even all the way to Luzon. Many oral histories of the Chinese in Chinese Maranaos mention that relations between Chinese and Moros are friendlier than between Christians and Muslims. If you remember Rizal's exile in Dapitan, even in the small community, there was a Chinese sari-sari store. And in many hinterlands or even the upland, the hills, the Chinese presence is always felt, and they made life easier for the natives because of their trading activities that's able to tie up, as I said, the trilogy of the Chinese, the natives, and the colonial economy. Finally, just some editing suggestions. If the Confucius Institute wishes to publish a volume, the Chinese transliteration should be consistent. In some, the pinyin is used. In some, the traditional spelling is used. For consistency, Song, S-U-N-G, and Song, for Song Dynasty, there should only be one. For example, Quanzhou should be Q-U-A-N or C-H-U-A-N, or Zufanzi is Z-H-U or C-H-U, as long as it is consistent, because it is confusing to be moving from one kind of spelling to another. But this is not Ms. Boncocan's fault, but someone knowledgeable in Chinese could perhaps make a decision on which one to use for the publication. Again, this is just a suggestion because this is a small matter. for the editor to decide in the future. But thank you very much, and Ms. Boncocan should be commended for the efforts in trying to do this kind of narrative that will give us more information on the Chinese Maranaos. Good afternoon, and thank you again.
Thank you, Ms. Ang See. Now let me call on Dr. Galang, Dr. Jely Galang, for his comments.
Good afternoon, everyone. I thank the Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University for inviting me to be one of the discussants on Professor Rhina Alvero Boncocan's paper. The paper is an attempt to trace the interactions between the Maranaos and the Chinese from the pre-Hispanic period, roughly around 10 to 12 century to the 19th century, using archival and other source materials, mainly from the National Archives of the Philippines in Manila, the Recollect Archives, and the UST Archives. It specifically aims to describe and analyze the political, economic, and social aspects of these interactions. The paper presents accounts on the Maranao region and the Maranaos as a people, as described in official records, the early trade contacts between this region and the Chinese, the Spanish military campaigns and religious missionary works in Mindanao, Chinese immigration and residence, and the Spanish colonial government's policies towards the Chinese in Mindanao. All these themes are crucial in understanding the context of Maranao-Chinese interactions, which the paper explained in detail. At the beginning of the paper, Professor Boncocan states her analysis of the Maranao-Chinese relations based on the primary material she has gathered thus far. She claims that during the period under investigation, that's the pre-colonial or pre-Hispanic until the end of the Spanish period, what occurred was indirect interactions between these two groups of people. She argues that such interactions, quote, seem to only be a mere consequence of the internal trading activities between the Maranaos and the trading centers of Sulu, Zamboanga, and Maguindanao, which directly engaged with Chinese traders, end of quote. This may partly explain why very little information is available regarding Maranao-Chinese interactions in the pre-19th century period. The more substantive part of the paper is found in the latter part of the paper, where Professor Boncocan presents interesting data on the Chinese living in the Misamis region during the second half of the 19th century. Using materials from the Padrón General de Chinos and Contribución Industrial, she was able to sketch the basic profile of the Chinese in the area, identifying the religious affiliations, occupations, places of origin, and others. My suggestion is that she should provide some explanation on why more direct interactions between the Maranaos and the Chinese occurred in the latter part of that century. I'm thinking, for example, that there was a considerable presence of the Chinese in this part of Mindanao because the area was relatively pacified. After Spain's successful military campaigns in Balangin in Sulu in 1848, Davao in 1849, and Cotabato in 1852, the Spaniards' next goal was to occupy the entire island of Mindanao, including Misamis, but of course with the help of religious missionaries, particularly the Recollects in the case of the Provincia de Misamis. But other factors must also be explored. For example, during the second half of the 19th century, there were commercial ships from Singapore that were traveling to Zamboanga and then to northern Mindanao and Illana Bay, which may have facilitated the ease of movement of the Chinese from other parts of western Mindanao to the Maranao region. Another important factor worth considering to expand the paper are the economic activities in areas outside of Mindanao, in the south of Mindanao, such as Labuan and Sandakan, where Chinese merchants and coolies played a very crucial role. Is it possible that Chinese merchants, shopkeepers, laborers, and agriculturists in the Misamis region during the latter part of the 19th century originated from these areas and not from the Visayas or not from Luzon? The emergence also and development of a cash crop economy must also be given attention, especially in relation to the Chinese in Mindanao in general and the Chinese in Misamis in particular. For example, there were companies, Spanish and foreign companies, that employed Chinese laborers to work on their plantations. For example, the Spanish company Aldecoa y Compañía employed hundreds of Chinese laborers to work on their abaca plantations in Misamis, Surigao, Samar, and Leyte in the second half of the 19th century, particularly during the 1870s, 1880s period. As mentioned, the paper also discusses the Spanish colonial policies imposed upon the Chinese in the Philippines, but it has to be noted, however, that there were also policies specifically applied to the Chinese wanting to go to Mindanao. Although the Spaniards were slowly occupying various areas of the island of Mindanao, they were still suspicious of the British, German, and Chinese merchants in the region who, from the Spaniards' point of view, might cause military and security problems. For example, in 1850, the Chinese, especially those from Manila, going to Mindanao, were required to apply for numerous documentary requirements before they were allowed to go to the south. My final point is that Professor Boncocan may want to revise the title of her paper because its focus in the version that was sent to me by Steph, the focus is more on the Chinese in Misamis or Lanao rather than Maranao-Chinese interactions. However, depending on additional material she may gather in the future, she may still stick with the original title of her paper. So that's just a suggestion. Professor Boncocan's paper presents a sort of introduction about the Maranao-Chinese relations during the pre-colonial and Spanish colonial period. It also points to the need to look for more archival resources to reconstruct this type of interaction between these two people. I was thinking perhaps aside from the Padrones de Chinos and the Contribution Industrial, Professor Boncocan may also need to check the Anfion record series at the National Archives of the Philippines, Anfion or the Opium. There are some studies on the Chinese in Mindanao using the Anfion because one of the main occupations of the Chinese in Mindanao and elsewhere in the Philippines was the opium contractor or contractor of opium dens. So Anfion is opium. So there are a number of bundles, Anfion bundles at the NAP that Professor Boncocan can check. So to add additional materials, in his paper. We all hope that the pandemic will be over soon and that we can get access to these archival materials. I'm certain that there are many more documents that we can use to reconstruct a history of the Chinese in the Misamis Lanao area during the Spanish colonial period. Congratulations to Professor Boncocan. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Dr. Galang. We will make sure to let Ms. Rhina Boncocan know about the comments. So for the next paper, it is authored by Dr. Faina Ulindang and Ms. Kristian Sulmayor. Dr. Faina Ulindang retired from the Mindanao State University in 2015 and has since taught at Xavier Ateneo de Cagayan University and Iligan Medical Center College as a professorial lecturer in history. Her specialization is on Mindanao migrants and has authored a book and several journal articles on this subject. While Mr. Kristian Sulmayor is a faculty member of the Department of History, Political Science, and International Studies of Xavier University Ateneo de Cagayan. He is also currently serving the city of Cagayan de Oro, being one of the commissioners of Cagayan de Oro Historical and Cultural Commissions. The discussants for these sessions are Dr. Leee Neri and Dr. Tina Clemente. Dr. Leee Neri is an associate professor and currently the deputy director, program secretary at the Archaeological Studies Program, University of the Philippines, Diliman. He was a former president of the Kapisanan ng Archaeologists sa Pilipinas Incorporated. It's a professional guild of archaeologists in the Philippines. Dr. Tina Clemente is a professor at the Asian Center, University of the Philippines, Diliman. Her research interests include China studies, Chinese in the Philippines, development studies, and economic history. She is the editor-in-chief of the Chinese Studies Journal. Now let's welcome Dr. Ulindang and Mr. Sulmayor for their presentation.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to express
Good afternoon. Thank you very much.
May we express our gratitude to the Confucian Institute for their generous support for this project, probing Chinese Maranao relations during the pre-Spanish and Spanish period. We prepared a recording for this presentation, and me and my partner Kristian has done mainly the technical portion, and so we are now going to start this recording. We did this in order to avoid connectivity problems, being here in Mindanao, quite far from the center. So this is it. Kristian, maybe we can start now. Kristian, you have something to say also.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And this is our pre-recorded video. So we'd like to ask the tech team to please start. Thank you.
That's for the introduction. Okay, our topic is about the dynamics of China trade in Mindanao before 1898, contextualizing for Hispanic and Hispanic Sino-M'ranao relation. This is our outline. And our introduction. Maritime trade in Southeast Asia during the early 10th century is considered central in the study of Chinese relationship with its southern neighbors. The geographic proximity as well as the favorable political conditions in the Chinese Empire under the Sung propelled a trading activity that was solid and beneficial for all the actors. William Henry Scott contended that it was actually beneficial for all the actors. And he contended that the Filipinos were the first to visit China, even before the Chinese came to the Philippines, which was a recognition of China's grandeur and abundant resources. The Sung and subsequent Tang dynasty saw fit to encourage exploration for the purpose of trade to benefit its people. This policy, however, was not consistent throughout the long dynastic rule in China. Such characterized its trade relations towards the Arabs, Indians, Malays, as well as the people of insular South Asia, the Philippines in particular, known to the Chinese as those in Mai or Mindoro, Butuan and Dapitan in Mindanao, Palawan, Sulu, and then later Manila, which eclipsed the Mindoro trade thanks to the Spaniards. Sulu trade was well documented and had the reputation that once upon a time, maritime trade in insular Southeast Asia and the island of Sulu was its center, especially when Malacca, the famous global entrepot, was captured by the Dutch from Portuguese hands. This had disturbed the distribution of power where control of trading rights was central from among the indigenous empires such as Jayavarman, and which was planted by the European powers, beginning with the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and lastly, the British. The isolated Philippine Islands remained the only Spanish territory in its 300 years in the island Southeast Asia. At this point, Sulu and Mindanao in southern Philippines were already participants of this Southeast Asia maritime trade, a membership that was endorsed by their Islamic conversion. Thus, it was natural that alongside this vibrant trade would be social transformation that meant introduction of new life ways as well as beliefs and solidarity with the neighboring islands. Parts of Mindanao, the second largest island in the Philippines, would share a common religion, Islam, with Sulu. Maguindanao, a nascent sultanate on its large island, would eventually share its religion, Islam, to its neighbor Lanao through a natural process, that is, exchange of goods. According to one source, Lanao was under the sway of the Maguindanao Sultanate, and accordingly, Islam was also embraced by its people, the Maranao, although not necessarily its plaza. A map of Mindanao below would show how Cotabato Province and Lanao provinces share their boundaries as indicated by the arrow to Malabang. Now, trade route from China to the Philippines and back before the coming of Spaniards. This research is an attempt to show the following. First, in the historical development of Sulu maritime trade, there were both direct and indirect relations between the Chinese and the Maranaos of Mindanao. Second, this relationship was characterized by a business dynamic, which, among other things, was bolstered by a common religion, Islam. Third, Chinese goods dominated this trading, especially with the advent of the Sulu trade. Fourth, in the course of trading, however, exchange was not only in the manner of commodities, but also resulted in the diffusion of Chinese culture. Chinese culture. This study, moreover, concludes that Chinese presence in Lanao areas, the territory of the Maranaos, can be traced in three ways. Slide 5, originating from, slide 4, originating from the Sulu, the first wave before the coming of the Spaniards. They spread to Mindanao Island by way of Zamboanga and Cotabato. With the coming of the Spaniards, the second wave, especially during the 18th to 19th centuries from the Visayas, particularly Cebu, by way of Misamis, northern Mindanao, then town of Tubigan. The third wave, which was proximate to Marawi. Their increased presence was beginning to be felt in Lanao, particularly Marawi, Dansalan, with the advent of the American period. Now, note on the use of the word wave. Aware of the discredited waves of migration theory by H. Olivier, our use of word wave should be construed as a convenient periodization tool to connote the intended presence of Chinese to trade with Mindanao Island coming from the nearby islands of Sulu and Visayas. Wave, as used, also does not connote a homogeneous group of people, such as race, with similar objectives. As seen, for example, on the third wave, Chinese laborers, artisans, or engineers would settle in the Misamis, Lanao area towards the end of Spanish period. First wave.
I will
Okay.
talk about the first wave. The first wave of Chinese presence in Mindanao, the Sulu maritime trade in Zamboanga and Cotabato towards the Lanao province, precursor to Maranao-Chinese relations. So, with a subsequent topic to discuss on the early Chinese records on maritime trade in the Philippines, particularly on Mindanao. During the Sung dynasty from 960 to 1278, reference to their Southeast Asia trade can be found in the works of Chao Jukwa, 3 centuries before the Magellan expedition. In it are the chapters on Mayi or Mindoro and Shli Sanshi, Kanshi, which is Visayas, Lin Xing, Luzon, and Pu Lilu, the Mindanao. The Northern and South Song dynasty were then described as having a medieval economic revolution. Moreover, it was the heyday of modern currency, such as increased money supply, bills of exchange, and new forms of credit and paper money, as well as innovative foreign trade policies. During this same period, it was also written that yellow wax, cotton, pearls, shells, betel knots, and Utah textiles were sourced from Mindanao. These were exchanged for silk, umbrellas, porcelain, and basket woven from rattan from China. Moreover, Pulilu or Mindanao was described as quote unquote, its villages are very densely populated, but its inhabitants are very cruel and inclined to piracy. End of quote. Canton that the Mindoro traders were allowed direct trading subsequently. The more famous Sulu trade can be dated with the Yuan dynasty, when presumably Islam was introduced. At that time, the Chinese thought of Sulu as equal to Malacca as an international trade emporium. Another tribute mission was that of the Butuan, east of Mindanao Island, which was actually predates Sulu in terms of its relationship with China. In this map, you can see here, taken from the documents of Genesis Velas during his presentation in one of the conferences of the Philippine International Quincentennial Celebration, entitled Tracing Maritime Silk Road. So you can see in this map the Eastern China trade route. And another map to show here is the trade route from Thailand to Mindanao. Okay, another map taken as well from the same source, Genesis Velas. And also, this map is also very interesting. You can see here the what do you call this one? The flow, no, the route of the Chinese trading, which involves largely Southeast Asia. And this map was also taken from the presentation of Genesis, where you can see here old names of the Philippines, of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. And this particular map, you can see here the involvement of Yat-sen Oton, now known as Iloilo, the Puduan or Butuan, the Mekong, Manakan, I think this is somewhere in Zamboanga, same way the Shahuchung or Shokon, also in Zamboanga, and the Wenduling, Cotabato, and the Sulu. In this particular table, we'll show you the major products. Sorry for that. The major products from the Chinese from the Chinese trades towards Southeast Asia. So this is basically Southeast Asia in general. So these are the items in here. You can see here the major items being delivered to Southeast Asia, and that basically these items were also found in the Philippines. So this is a comprehensive table wherein you can see here that the year, specific dynasty, and the specific items related to that dynasty that they brought to Southeast Asia.
As mentioned on the second way, as mentioned, Sulu enjoyed its heyday even before the Spaniards controlled Manila. Stimulated by the China trade, this pre-Spanish activity was dependent on slave labor, as the Sultanate needed gatherers of pearls and pearl shells, seaweeds, and other sea products. Camphor, bird's nest, rattan, leche de mar, cocoa, tortoise shells, and wax. Chinese junks from Amoy visited in March and April until in August, beginning of August, when favorable monsoon winds prevailed over Chinese Sea. Their trade items included cotton, silk, satin red, and checked grass, clothing, handkerchief, cutlery, guns, ammunition, opium, lumber, china, and glassware, and other items allowed during China's classical imperial history. However, the growing aggressive policy of the Spaniards, having captured Manila and its environs from the Moro Datus by 1565, thereby integrating the entire archipelago to Spanish sovereignty, brought a major change in the China trade. Despite the fact that the Treaty of Tordesillas, as mentioned in this slide, had actually prohibited the trade with China, according to this treaty. And however, the galleon trade was introduced in order to incentivize Spanish functionaries or civil officials. These officials forcibly tried to monopolize the China trade's control by patrolling the seas within the Philippine Islands with their steam-powered boats, consequently dislodging the Moros from their coastal supremacy. Slave raiding along the coastal inhabitants in Visayas and Luzon fell prey to these marauders for more than 100 years, even earlier than the Spanish rule. However, the determined defense by the Spaniards, with the help of Filipino natives of Luzon and Visayas, commenced the gradual decline of Sulu Sultanate. Okay. Next. Moreover, mentions of Kawit in Mindanao from early Spanish sources suggest of Spanish interest in commodities that were in demand during that time. Take note, however, about their disdain of the Mindanaoans. In the slide number 13, disdain of them. Inevitably, by the 19th century, international trade based in Manila eclipsed the national eclipsed Sulu as a trading port and was practically finished. This lingerie and the retaliatory trade which characterized most of the 3 centuries of Spanish rule. It is worthwhile mentioning at this point that the abolition of galleon trade which was dependent on the arrival of Chinese sampans bringing Chinese trade goods, was largely due to the failure of the Spanish government to gain a direct access to China. Like other European countries, the Spanish government was not successful in dealing with the Chinese Empire trade between. Okay. So the Chinese in Cotabato. In the island of Mindanao, however, Spanish forces attest of Chinese merchants present in Cotabato, such as Father Marty's mission superior in his letter of 10 February. It mentions of Chinese presence of Cotabato and reports of in the following manner. But because may I quote it here, no? But because the boats went ahead and the Moros and the Chinese must have told him that Toto, God knows what, Chinese he refused to appear, no? He refused to appear, means that Toto. A rich Chinese will come with an arroba when they meet they, as long as the little ones are in Cotabato. Finally, a group of Moros came back at night as usual to a cattle shed of chiffon. The Chinese, and slaughtered a good number of cows, which happened right after the burning of the Tamontaka mission houses. The town Tamontaka is good, with many apparently well-stocked Chinese stores. And in Zamboanga, though it described the city as in reference to the Chinese, there are a fair number of Chinese who are nowhere absent and go about their favorite occupation, retail merchandising, and even complains that what worth matter is the unbounded avarice of Chinese who sell for uh, 6 pesos the rice they buy for 3, and the palay bought in Zamboanga at 1 peso or 9 reales for 2 pesos and 5 reales. All these are quoted from Pastel's letter of uh, dated in several letters, dated in February, in May of 1886, 1880, etc. Now, this shows to us that indeed the Chinese were well placed in Cotabato, which was just near Lanao. Next. All right. So furthermore, an early description of the quotas, no, of the of in Lanao, is given. Note that while the natives manufactured their arms and cannons, it is the Chinese who supplied them with lantakas. Okay, so for defense, second way, Maranao's construct traps, dig pits, set bamboo points. They also use various kinds of lantakas and other kinds of firearms with which the Chinese supplied them or which they manufactured themselves. They were considered contraband of war during the Spanish regime. Okay. Now we go to the second wave.
Okay, so for the third wave, yes, the third wave, it was actually mentioned earlier that as seen, or I mean, shown in the map earlier of a Chinese migration into Lanao during the 1800s. So As you can see here, the Chinese population in Lanao grew as the Spaniards were gaining headway over their Moro enemies. Governor General Blanco recruited 1,000 Chinese and native laborers from Luzon to build a road and a bridge connecting Iligan and Marawi. This bridge is known today as Pantar Bridge, which was previously named as General Alfonso Bridge. It was alleged that the first 2 of 3 kilometers were built by the 1,000 Chinese contracted from Manila, as well as the columns of the bridge, with the intention of not having to build a costly bridge over the Iligan Agus River. It was decided to construct a train station, which never materialized, of course, no, on the left bank of that particular river, and then enclose it with a wall where inside would be the living quarter of the Chinese, their office, and their storehouse for the materials, and garrisoned by 2 companies. This railway project was also mentioned in a Spanish source mentioned by Mamitua Saber, a Maranao sociologist, in one of his works. On your screen, you can see there a map. That gray or black dots you can see on the Mindanao map represents the presence of Chinese, no, in the area, particularly Lanao and Cotabato during the Spanish period. With the Philippines' participation in the world trade, demand for cash crops led the Spaniards to rethink their policy regarding Chinese travel restrictions to the provinces. By the 1850s, new ports were opened in Suwal, Pangasinan, in Cebu, and in Iloilo. The Chinese were encouraged to trade and gather the needed cash crops for exports such as abaca, copra, and sugar. This opportunity made the Philippines a magnet for Chinese from the mainland who were suffering from poverty as an aftermath of peasant unrest, such as the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864. The opening of Hong Kong, now a British settlement, facilitated Chinese migration elsewhere in the world, especially Southeast Asia. With the Spanish liberal policy, Chinese from Cebu saw Iligan in Lanao as a land of opportunity and migrated there. According to the anecdote of Si Hoc Yun, who grew up in Chusan, Quemoy, China, he migrated to the Philippines in 1889 at 18 years old, wanting to have a better life. He said that it was his father who exhorted him that to have a better life, one must go abroad. He still remembered the ship called Southern Born. Bound for Manila, he took together with a family friend and another Chinese. From Manila, they took another boat called Minoa, bound for Cebu. At Cebu, he worked as bookkeeper for a relative's business. By April 1890, his brother Si Ko Chuan, who owned a shop in Iligan, invited him to come and work here. He resigned from his job in Cebu and joined his brother. He remembered the boat he took was called Bais. Meantime, in the province of Misamis, which is composed of what is today Misamis Occidental, Misamis Oriental, Lanao del Norte, Bukidnon, and Camiguin, it was noted that in 1895, there was a growing presence of Chinese immigrants that totaled 770. By 1880s, Chinese traders became well established in Misamis, the Cagayan, now known as Cagayan de Oro City, which was the capital of Misamis province. Another hint as to the Chinese presence in Lanao, Misamis, could be inferred from a biographical sketch of a Chinese mestiza named Sandigan Onchay Abrugena, who became the first Maranao woman teacher. She was born in 1910 at Tamparan, Lanao del Sur, to parents Chaya Ong, a Chinese, and Maranao woman, Muranao Sambuang. Although the year when she was born was an American period in Philippine history, Chaya Ong could have been a long-time resident of Lanao and must have been accepted in the Maranao society. Furthermore, marriage with him by a Maranao woman must have been Islamic, since the custom for the Maranao woman was to exclusively marry only Muslim men. In this paper, um, we have argued that through trade, Chinese Muslims were welcomed in Mindanao and Sulu and may have been facilitated and spread of this religion. Chayaong could have migrated from Cotabato to Lanao or from Iligan to Tamparan. The increasing emphasis uh, on agricultural development transition, as mentioned above, to a more liberal policy regarding migration. Thus, according to Wickberg, development of commercial agriculture in the Philippines, especially after 1820, provided new opportunities for wholesalers to buy up agricultural produce in the rural areas and send it to Manila for shipment to overseas markets. This occupation was dominated with great profit by the Chinese mestizos, a Filipinized group whose closest associations were with the Spaniards and China.
Okay. Then, okay. Conclusion. Chinese dispersion into the provinces by the 19th century trade, agricultural land settlement, and cultural diffusion in Lanao. Opportunities in agricultural production, especially rice, was becoming a preoccupation, especially after 1850, when, because of international trade, attention was towards developing cash crops. The steady need for local commodities like rice brought the Chinese to the provinces, especially where rice was scarce. Rice scarcity was acute in Cebu, and eventually Chinese businessmen would look for more lucrative rice producers in Misamis in the island of Mindanao. It must be realized that Spanish sovereignty was imposed on Mindanao, especially along the coastal provinces, such as Misamis, which during this period remained undivided with Lanao as an adjacent boundary. Instruction by the missionaries was instrumental in this endeavor. For example, Father Ricard, a Recollect missionary, had jurisdiction over Maranding, Lanao. The Spaniards won Misamis province over the incursions of Lanao Moros led by Amay Pakpak. Eventually, with the help of the missionaries like Father Fermi and Barado, Spanish troops were able to enter Marawi. The Spanish flag was raised over Lanao in August 1891. Thus, it was by way of Misamis that Lanao was occupied by the Spaniards. This would secure the migration of the science and traders like the Chinese in Mindanao. As a concluding episode, in this study of Maranao, Chinese relations before 1898, the following story is instructive. The niece of Sultan Kudarat, Pindawa-Dawa Oray, was married to Balindong Buzar, a Maranao, and his Kudarat's sister Gayang to Amanat Tunding Anuni, the founder of Pangampong sa Unayan, also known as Janatu Naim of Bukit. This was intended as a political measure, that is to expand Sultan Kudarat's influence over Lanao. Accordingly, Sultan Kudarat also descended from Maranao and Antwerp. These intermarriages were symbolized by the abdans. No? These 16 abdans are Chinese stone jars, as you can see in the picture, given as a royal wedding gift, and were the primary material means of cementing strategic alliances and rewarding the loyalty of potential elite allies. Abdan is a Magindanaoan term for a Chinese-made stoneware jar. Moreover, the Maranao term omoy means Chinese-made jar. These were believed to carry a symbol of power and taraka prestige. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And we now welcome questions from the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Now, may I call on Dr. Lee Anthony Neri for his comments?
Okay, thank you, Steph. Hi, Ma'am, Ma'am Faina and Sir Christian. First of all, I would like to thank the Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University for inviting me as a discussant of this paper of Dr. Faina Ulindang and Professor Christian's paper, which is the dynamics of China trade in Mindanao before 1898, contextualizing pre-Hispanic and Hispanic Sino-M'ranao relation. For everyone's information, the author of this paper is also my co-researcher for the for the project probing the Maranao-Chinese relation before 1898. So which are being presented in this conference also. So for a disclaimer, as I mentioned to Chris Garcia, who was our moderator this morning, he emailed me and inviting me for a discussion for this paper, and I told him that I am an archaeologist. I'm not really a specialist on history or the history of Maranao, but as an archaeologist, we specialize in material culture or artifacts. And we know for a fact that these material culture or artifacts, they gave an important role in the interpretation of data. And the presence of tradeware ceramics will help us infer the import and then export of the material goods from our point. So now going back to the paper of Dr. Ulindang and Professor Sulmayor's, the authors, based on historical accounts and secondary sources, narrated the mobility and dispersion of the Chinese people in Mindanao before and after the arrival of the European colonizers in the Philippines. The Chinese to Lanao region were traced based on the three waves. First wave, before the coming of the European colonizers, the Chinese presence from Sulu to Zamboanga Peninsula and Maguindanao. The second wave, presence of the Europeans in the 18th to 19th century, which is the Chinese presence from Cebu to northern Mindanao towards Iligan. And the third wave, which is the advent of the American period from 19th to 20th century, Chinese movement from Zamboanga and Misamis to Lanao area. Now let's discuss the first wave. The first wave, according to the paper, before the coming of the European colonizers, Chinese migrated from Sulu to Zamboanga Peninsula and Maguindanao. The authors anchored their narration on the annals of Chao Jokwa during the Song Dynasty. Because of this active maritime trading between Sulu and China, Chinese traders probably started to stay, intermarried, and lived in Sulu. Then they slowly started moving from Sulu to Zamboanga Peninsula and Maguindanao. But we have also to take note that as early as 700 AD or 7th century, during the Tang Dynasty, Sulu and China were already actively trading based on the Tang ceramics found in Sulu and Tang Dynasty coin found in Basilan. Aside from Sulu, Butuan also played a major role in the prehistory of the island of Mindanao. Butuan, according to Scott, was the first Philippine state to establish diplomatic trade relation with China. As early as the Song Dynasty, the kingdom of Butuan was already mentioned in the annals. According to Margarita Zambrano, who is also an anthropologist, as early as the 10th century AD, the Sama seafarers from Butuan were already active in trading with the Arabs, Indian, Persian, Khmer, Thai, and most especially with the Chinese traders. These were based on the ceramics found in Butuan. The Kingdom of Butuan has an advanced transit point from and trading center in Mindanao. Just like Sulu, the metropolitan in Mindanao may have attracted a number of Chinese to stay, cross-culture intermarriages, and live in Butuan. Now, as a discussant of this paper, I'm just looking at the other side of the coin, that because of the simultaneous active trading activities in Mindanao during the Song Dynasty, we have Sulu in the west and Butuan in the northeast. Is it possible that these Chinese people may have simultaneously migrated to the Lanao region, not just only from the Sulu as proposed? So, because we have to also considering that the Tausug are the one of the dominant ethnic group in Sulu archipelago, was believed to migrated from Butuan to Sulu, and this is around 1000 AD, and this was based on the linguistic evidence between the people of Tausug and Butuan. Now, for the second wave, which is the presence of the European around 18th to 19th century, Chinese migrated from Cebu to northern Mindanao towards Iligan. In this wave, the authors failed to discuss the historic evidence as compared to the first wave on the migration of the Chinese people from Cebu to northern Mindanao in the 18th to 19th century. Instead, they discuss the relationship and trading activities of the Maranao-Iranon from Illana Bay, Illana del Sur, and Butuan. These Maranao-Iranon were considered a notorious coastal pirates. Slave raiding activity is not distinct and unique in the Philippines. This has been practiced in entire Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. Even before the coming of the Spaniards, communities residing along the coast were already fortified. These raiders were known in history as Balangigi, Tausug, Samal, Maguindanao, Iranon, and Maranao. For the Spaniards, it has named Moros as a generic term for them. The height of the maritime raiding was in the 7th to 18th century by the Maguindanao and Tausug. This has been continued and worsened by the Iranon and Balangigi in the middle of the 18th century onwards. This raiding activity did not exempt the coastal area of northern Mindanao. In fact, a number of folklore of different towns in Misamis Oriental suggest this kind of activity, just like the municipality of Initaw and the municipality of Mantigaw. Aside from folklore, European colonizers also built strong and massive structures to fortify the coastal communities against Moro pirates in the 18th to 19th century, which means a number of archaeological ruins has been identified, and we've done a lot of studies on this in the coastal area of Misamis Oriental. We were able to identify fort, also there were slash church, and at the same time a watchtower. So these are all, a majority of these are found in Laguindingan, municipality of Laguindingan, municipality of Opol, Alupihit, El Salvador, Initaw, and Hasaan. So I was just wondering, given this endemic threat in Mindanao around 18th to 19th century, would you think that these Chinese would still continue to move to Lanao, considering that the area was the hometown, quote unquote, or near the hometown of the coastal pirates? Now for the third wave, according to the authors in the 19th towards the 20th century, with the abolition of the galleon trade, the Philippines actively participated in the international trade. This gave Chinese an opportunity to engage in commercial activity, such as import and export of cash crops. As a result, the Chinese spread and migrated all over the Philippine archipelago, including northern Mindanao. Based on the archaeological evidence, this third wave has been strongly supported by the number of kitchen sink artifacts found in northern Mindanao, as far as the Pitan or the Pitan city in Zamboanga del Norte. Kitchen sink porcelain is a type of ceramics that was mass produced in China, particularly in the provincial kiln in Fujian and Guangdong in the 18th to 20th century. These ceramics were intentionally produced for the general public in China and used extensively for their daily household activities. These wares, the kitchen sink, were also exported outside China to its neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines. So kitchen sink has been found in northern Mindanao. Thus, the paper on the third wave support the massive migration of the Chinese to Mindanao. These can be supported by archaeological facts based on the kitchen sink found. Majority were found in the coastal area of northern Mindanao. Now, I think I am done with the first, second, and third wave, and thank you and congratulations to the author for the extensive historical research of this paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neri. Now, may I call on Dr. Tina Clemente for her comments?
Right. Okay. Can everyone hear me? All right. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Confucius Institute for inviting me here. It's a privilege to be part of this program, especially that Mindanao is the main thing, no? And we feel that in the discourse, Mindanao needs to be better represented. So thank you so much, Dr. Ellen Palanca, for organizing this and for inviting me. All right, okay. So I was given 10 minutes to react, right? So first, I'd like to commend Dr. Ulindang. Hello, Dr. Faina. We met before at the alumni event of the Asian Center, right? And then Mr. Kristian Sulmayor also. So this is a very difficult undertaking. So I'd like to commend them for taking this initiative. It's a big step, no, towards improving our knowledge especially when it comes to Maranao, because as the paper points out, the other polities have been extensively documented and covered and studied. So I was really looking forward to a more focused discussion on Chinese Maranao relations. Okay. Having said that, as I read the paper, especially the long discussion on the pre-Hispanic part, I did appreciate the effort to contextualize Chinese Maranao relations within the larger dynamic of Chinese relations with Mindanao. However, I got the sense that perhaps because of the difficulty in gathering sources and data, the discussion on the Maranaos was somewhat peripheral, but perhaps with more data to work on in the coming days or weeks, with the help of the Confucius Institute, this could be rectified. So I just have a few suggestions on maybe how to enrich the paper and how to make it better. My first is that maybe the paper can benefit from a better clarification of the political economy dynamic in pre-Hispanic Mindanao Island and Sulu, and locate how the Maranao people fit into this picture. So for example, Maguindanao and Sulu figure prominently in historical accounts, and we know that already. It's because these two were dominant pre-state polities at the time. Of course, this dominance needs to be properly periodized because the level of power and influence is contingent on domestic and international conditions that change over time. But I want to underscore that what strongly predicated the dominance of these two polities was their involvement in international trade. So Chinese trade was recognized as integral to amassing power and spreading influence. And in contrast, for most of the Maranao's history in a comparable time period, controlling the sea and coastal trade, as James Warren argues, was not much of a concern, right? And it's not surprising, again, given the location of Lanao. But I'm really interested in the insights that we can draw from internal conditions, right? Which have to do with institutional development. So meaning to say, the idea of contextualization is already there. However, more effort needs to be done in unpacking the linkages, right? So that it doesn't become a discussion on Sulu, and it doesn't become a discussion on Maguindanao and Butuan, and then on the side we speculate because of the proximity, no, that there may have been relations. No? So you all know. So one thing is again to dig deeper into how the Maranao domains, or how the Maranao people fit into that larger political dynamic. So even if direct trade wasn't a thing during pre-Hispanic times, there's still much to say about it and why. And so this brings me to my second point. So if you look at the literature again and the different historical accounts, the development of these pre-state polities was contingent on factors, right? Such as population, the environment, like if the soil was fertile, or location, if it was near the coast or not, and international trade, particularly Chinese trade. So for example, the paper mentions descriptions from different sources. And at one point in time, Mindanao inhabitants were described as cruel and inclined to piracy. So this is the account of Chao, okay? On the other hand, elsewhere in the paper, Sulu was compared to Malacca as an important trade center. But if you go back to the primary sources, various polities in pre-Hispanic times, or in pre-Hispanic domains, which we now know as the Philippines, had different descriptions, right? So earlier in the previous session, Mai or Bai was mentioned, right? And so if you look at the primary accounts, there's really so much said about the conditions, that they were so organized, that there were procedures for docking, that there was a duration for trade, there were specific terms of exchange, no? And in another polity, trade was only possible if hostages were taken. No, so what I'm trying to say is that these descriptions do not contradict, but instead they provide some sort of a spectrum, a picture, a bigger picture of how institutional development was. And so it's uneven, right? Because essentially of the factors we mentioned before, it depends on what conditions prevail, no? So if you put them all together, they paint an interesting picture of varying levels of institutional development and the prevailing conditions in the political, economic, demographic, and environmental habitus. And so what I am curious about is how, this is a question now, how does the domain of the Maranaos fit into a spectrum of this institutional development, no? Which necessarily shapes the nature of engagement with the Chinese, right? So yun eh. So it's really very interesting. Well, in the past, I found it really funny many years ago, decades ago even, when people would use these primary sources to talk about the honesty of the Filipinos, or on the other hand, the cruelty of the Filipinos, depending on what account you're looking at, right? But to me, I found it really insightful because of the insight that it shed on the unevenness, right, of development, and how those factors would necessarily interact with trade relations with China. Okay, so my next comment is perhaps the paper can benefit from a tighter correspondence between documentary sources, the archaeological record, and local history. So, for example, the presence of porcelain, which was mentioned in the paper, or prestige goods, can have a lot to say about social structure, political dynamics, and economics. But even the types of forest goods, no, that were traded with China directly or indirectly provide a lot of insight towards unpacking what the prevailing conditions were. Many archaeological studies, because there really are so many, and maybe perhaps Laura Junker's work might be a good place to start, for the authors. So these studies were able to unpack an extensive internal network of trade that ultimately were linked to Chinese trade. So the paper mentions how the Chinese goods possibly reached the Maranaos, but on the other hand, I want to know what goods the Maranaos used to exchange, right? So because meaning just because they weren't into direct trade, it doesn't mean that the story is done, right? So looking back and looking into these archaeological studies, I found it extremely insightful. They spoke volumes, about the bigger picture of trade. That it wasn't just the direct coastal trade that was important, but it was also the internal networks, right? That the coastal states would attend to, so that whatever goods the Chinese demanded could be delivered. So that means it wasn't just them, it was an entire internal network. And so I think this is worthy to unpack. I mean, there were descriptions on other polities, and I am just wondering if it's possible, given more time and data, to uncover, right? At the very least, what were the activities or what were the goods, right, that the Maranaos used to exchange to get these goods, right? The analysis on the Hispanic period, I feel, is much easier because of it, the information that we have right now, right? I think perhaps that section just needs to be unpacked a little bit more, so that there could be a more integrated discussion on the demographic, social, political, and economic conditions. So I like so much that there are oral histories, but perhaps we could maximize those more. And so these factors would necessarily interact with Chinese settlement, considering the backdrop of colonial accommodation. So overall, I feel that it's a worthy project, except that, of course, there are impediments in the kind of data, the kind of information that we have right now. But even with the challenge of getting more sources or getting more information, there's still a lot to explore, in the other things, like just strengthening the linkages, right? Just strengthening the linkages so that we could go a little bit beyond the speculation, the speculative aspect, of the interrogation. So I think that's already a lot to say. Sa political dynamic pa lang, marami nang pwedeng sabihin at ikabit. We try to locate in this big picture where the Maranao and how the Maranaos fit. So I guess I don't have time anymore. I'd like to keep to the time that was given to me, so I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tina Clemente, for that. So we will now proceed to our next paper, next presentation. Next presentation is authored by Professor Darwin Absari. He is currently an assistant professor and college secretary at the UP Institute of Islamic Studies, teaching Islamic thought, legacies of Islamic civilization, and moral history, society, and culture. His other research interests include pre-Hispanic Philippine history, Islam in Southeast Asia, and others. The discussants of this session are Dr. Juvanni Caballero, who is a professor of history at Mindanao State University, Iligan Institute of Technology. He is concurrently the campus secretary and chief of staff of the Office of the Chancellor of the said university. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Philippines in Diliman, Quezon City. The second discussant is Dr. Michael Tan, who is a medical anthropologist. He is Professor Emeritus at the UP Diliman and was the immediate past chancellor of the institution. Let us now welcome Professor Absari.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that very brief introduction. And also, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my humble research on the history of Chinese in Sulu. If you may allow, I'd like to share my slide. I entitled my paper, The Lannang Su. This is generally the history of Chinese in Sulu, because there is other authors writing about the Taosu in China. So I just focus my paper on the history of Chinese in Sulu. So I started from what has been published. As you all know, the history of Sulu in its connection with China has been explored by many researchers. So I took off from there and also reinforced the data by from the interviews of some descendants and some historians and learners about the subject. And also I examined some physical evidences of the presence of the Lannang in Sulu. So just a brief background, Sulu today is a province, one of the poorest province in the country, and probably the most troubled region or province in the whole country. It is presently consisting of 19 municipalities with a total population of more or less 1 million as of 2020 census. But in the past, as you all know, Sulu was a thriving economic center in Southeast Asia. As you can see in this pre-Hispanic map, this is Philippines here, and all goods coming from outside, from this area, would practically be brought to Sulu first here in this small southern part of the country before it will be distributed in other parts of the country, especially in those important trading ports in pre-Hispanic time. So Sulu, its strategic location played a very important role in facilitating trade exchange as well as hosting of various civilizations, which resulted in a philosophical and cultural exchange that nurtured the growth of Sulu civilization. So as to the early contacts with China, there has been study about the presence of Tang Dynasty coins in Basilan and ceramics, although according to Professor Bayer, these were not brought by the Chinese themselves, but it was probably the Arabs, because the Arabs started to dominate the Southeast Asian trade. Another study shows that during the Song Dynasty, Sulu products must have already reached China. As an evidence, Basilan exported cotton in 1206. But it was the Yuan Dynasty from 1278 to 1368 AD that when Sulu appeared in, at least in the official record of China. And this was also the time when Sulu-China trade started to accelerate because of the new trading routes found directly from the southern parts of China to Sulu. So Sulu practically facilitated access to Celebes Sea going to the Strait of Makassar and east of Java. This is, I'm referring to the second route. As to the conduct of trade, Wang Taiyuan's document 1349, which has been mentioned several times by other researchers. As he observed, the Chinese brought gold, silver, beads, earthenware, cloth, and iron bars in exchange of Sulu products. Of course, the famous one is the pearl, beeswax, tortoise shell, and lacquer wood. And as for the Sulu pearls, in many records, Chinese traders made more than 100% profit. Initially, in the beginning, trade was negotiated on Chinese vessels' deck. So when Chinese ships would arrive, there's an announcement, the banging of the gong, and then the Tausug would go to the shore and climb to the Chinese vessels. And to keep the business continue, Tausug would demand some Chinese to stay to ensure that the Chinese would return. It doesn't appear like, it doesn't seem like a kidnap, but it's like a negotiation. Those Chinese who have been who have stayed in Sulu in the period of these trading activities were treated very well. And unfortunately, there was an interruption in the trade when Chinese policies prohibiting overseas trade was decreed in 1371. However, in 1403, when Emperor ascended, to the throne, and he dispatched the Muslim Admiral Cheng to Southeast Asia. And this is one of the famous expedition of a Muslim admiral from 1405 to 1435. And it was also during this period that a celebrated Chinese figure in Sulu must have visited and died in Sulu, which was followed later on by the sending of tribute of 3 Sulu rulers to Sulu in 1417, which is the most famous tribute missions in the country, and also followed by Basilan later on in 1412, in 1420. And during this time, Chinese started to come back to Sulu. And finally, in 1567, the policy prohibiting Chinese to trade overseas was abolished. So 2 ships traveled to Sulu annually. In 1628, there was already Chinese silk market in Sulu. This was destroyed by the Spaniards during their invasion in Sulu. During the last quarter of the 17th century, as was mentioned by other researchers, there was an acceleration of the Sulu-Manila trade. This was during the peace agreement and trade agreement between the Spaniards and the Sultanate of Sulu. So during this period, China trade became regular and intensive. From 1770 and 1800, there was an estimate of 18,000 Chinese from southern China that have visited Sulu. But of course, not all of them stayed. Sulu products were re-exported from Manila to Macau or Canton. And Sulu-Manila trade until 1830 became the vital link in the broadened pattern of Spanish-Philippine trade with China. The dramatic increase of the presence of Chinese in Sulu took place in 1758 when thousands of Chinese was massacred by the Spaniards. This was immediately after the British occupation of Manila. And by 19th century, the Chinese grew in terms of its population to 1/8 of the whole town population. These are some of the evidences of Chinese presence and trading activities in Sulu. You can find this in Sulu Museum just beside the provincial office. Okay, so there are 2 actually historical figures, Chinese historical figures in Sulu. First is Puntaupong, or the Honorable Fountainhead, which I mentioned earlier, that have visited Sulu during the expedition of Admiral Cheng. His real name, accordingly, was Bai Pishen, and he is one of the descendants of famous town poet Bai Yuzi. And he is popularly known in Sulu as the Chinese Muslim Admiral Bai Pishen. To some other account, accordingly, he served as guide of Admiral Cheng, and that he has arrived Sulu around 1410. He died in Sulu, and he was buried some few kilometers away from Holo Town. This is the picture of the entrance to the grave of Puntaupong. It's still standing until today, and there is an effort of the Sulu province in collaboration with Confucius and a Chinese architectural firm to renovate the area. This is the main grave on the left side, and on the right side is this stone tablet. This was first erected in 1721 by local Chinese businessmen. This is the artisan well that he digged for the people. It's still existing until today. It's called Kupong Dayang Dayang, or the Princess Well. This provides continuous water to the people in the area. And this is why he was called the Honorable Fountainhead, or Puntaupong. Okay, and there was also a temple built named after him, or a Puntaupong temple, in the early 60s. This picture shows a Chinese or the Lannang community in Sulu in 1969. This picture was taken inside the temple. And this temple was destroyed in 1974 during the burning of Holo, when there was an encounter between the Moro National Liberation Front and the military in Sulu, which resulted into the burning of the entire town, which include the Puntaupong temple. So after it was burned down in Sulu, another temple was built in Tawi-Tawi. And it's still standing up to today. This is the present appearance of the Puntakong temple in in Bonggao Tawi-Tawi. Another celebrated figure in Sulu is what is famously called Lannang. He is famous as a Muslim preacher who came with an Arab preacher sometime 14th or early 15th century. And there is a barangay or a community name after him, Barangay Kahoysina, because accordingly there was a tree when he used to meditate, and they named that tree as the Kahoysina or the Chinese tree, and was later on named after that Chinese tree. There was also an elementary school named after him. And this photo shows his grave. This small grave is his grave, and the other one, the larger grave, is the grave of a Muslim preacher. And when I did my research, it seems that all Arab preachers who have come to Sulu and Mindanao to spread Islam have always been accompanied or assisted by Muslim Chinese merchants and also preachers, because I found out that there are many existence of Muslim graves where you can also find the graves of a Lannang. So it was not only a particular Arab preacher where there was an accompaniment of a Chinese merchant, but practically all, most if not all of the Muslim preachers have been accompanied by Chinese, including the first Sultan who established the Sultanate of Sulu, because I saw another grave just near his grave on top of the mountain of it's called Tumantangis, or the Crying Mountain in Sulu. As you see on this left side, the left photo is actually a stone tablet excavated in Chuenzo. On the right side is the gravestone of the first Muslim preacher who came to the country. And this is the oldest physical evidence of Islam that we have in our country, dated 1310, and on the left side is dated 1302. If you look at the inscriptions and you see the translation, these two translations are the same. It says, said the prophet, whoever dies far away dies a martyr. To some scholars, particularly Mahul, he suggested that this gravestone in Sulu must have been carved in Chuenzo and brought by Chinese Muslim to Sulu. The other one of the living evidences of the Chinese Muslim contribution to the spread of Islam is this pillar. This pillar is the, you can find this pillar in the old mosque in the farthest south of the country, particularly the Simonal Island. The mosque was believed to have established or constructed by Karim al-Makdum, who came to the country around 1380. Although there was a carbon dating by the National Museum, it seems that this pillar was put up much later on. And the carvings is believed to have been done by a Chinese Muslim. Now, the life of Chinese in Sulu. As I mentioned, they are locally called Lannang, or meaning our people. Sometimes they are also called Sina, probably from the word China or from the Arabic word Sin, referring to the Chinese people. And in Sulu, they have been protected by the Sultan, and they had legal immunity from slavery. There was even a saying which is handed down from generation to generation, that if any Tauso would harm a Chinese in Sulu, the Sultan himself will execute whatever punishment. And they had representatives to the Ruma Bichara. Ruma Bichara is the highest governing group or decision-making policy of the Sultanate government. And as I mentioned, they also have participated in the Islamization process. And of course, they have brought economic prosperity. That's the most important. And they also had a community called Tindalaud, or the store in the ocean or store in the sea. Today it's still there. It's now reduced into one barangay, Barangay Tindalaud. It was devastated first during the typhoon in 1936, and then finally destroyed by the burning of Olo in 1974. And that's when many of the Chinese left Sulu. They also had the school called Tungjin School, which was established in 1920 and existed up until 2000. And in Sulu, of course, they have found home and they have found the sense of belongingness. That is why until today, Chinese in Sulu are proud to call themselves as Tao Su or Lannang Su, because they have, like I mentioned, they have found a home away from home where they have been protected. So that they also participated in the defense of against any invasion from outsiders. Particularly in 1773, they thousands of Chinese fought alongside with the Taosu during the Japanese invasion. Another one is Tan Sim Pao. He's actually a mestizo Taosu Chinese who was appointed as the head of the Sulu Royal Army of the Sultanate, and who died defending the palace in 1887. During Japan invasion, there was a special company D organized, and mostly they were composed of the Lannang Su. And then another resistance organized by Guyinan. This was in Kota Kinabalu in North Borneo in 1943. Up until the present, contemporary Bangsamoro struggle, a Tausug Chinese mestizo fought alongside with the Tausug. The first MNLF state chairman of Sulu was Bianting Lim. He was a Tausug Chinese. And then, of course, their long stay in Sulu resulted into intermarriages with the local, and they have left many descendants in Sulu. Some of them became politicians. In fact, the Tan ruling clan of Sulu today is of Chinese descent. By the end of the American period, practically they have controlled Sulu economy because, as you know, the more than 300 wars against Spain, Sulu economy started and slowly declined. And because Chinese were not harmed in Sulu, they had the freedom and liberty to transact business, which led them into the rise of Chinese economy in Sulu. Until during the time of American period, they practically controlled Sulu economy. This is the picture of Chinese Pier, or the Tindalaud, the Chinese community in Sulu, taken in 1927. This one also. And this is the photo of the school, Tongjin School, first established in 1920. These are some of the photos. And the photo, an example of a Chinese descent, a famous politician in Sulu. He is presently the governor. The vice governor is his son. The mayor is his nephew. So, and until today, there are many Chinese descendants who are actually in control of the local government landscape. In not just in Sulu, in Bungao, the mayor is also of Chinese descent, and many other towns and municipalities. Okay, because of their long stay, there was an exchange of culture, of philosophy, and spirituality, which allowed the Tausug people to inherit that practically enrich their own culture and way of life. One of those legacies is the dress style. The yellow color for royalty is obviously an influence of Chinese dress style. There is even a saying, a poetry, which says, timaas na inatay nakasawal Shanghai. Paggadayng angay impagsulubon kintay. Timaas na inatay nakasawal Shanghai. Paggadayng angay impagsulubon kintay. The pride has increased after wearing a Shanghai trousers, when in the past a pajama sack is worn. Kintay is a trouser made of a sack. There's until today the term Lannang is very famous. It refers to a silk cloth. Of course, Langking is the shoe polish. Bakya is a sandal for women. It was famous until the modern sandals and kiwi, were introduced. This is kantiu, a trouser. It's called in Sulu as kantiu, but it's the name kantiu actually derived from a Chinese trader named Teo, who usually sell Chinese silk and trousers. So people would ask, where did you buy that? Kantiu. Kantiu. Kan is a suffix referring to a person. So when you say kantiu, it's Teos. Until such time, the trouser became known as kantiu, and it's finally called kantiu. On songs and musical instruments, the famous luo, or the Tausug opera, is believed to have been of Chinese influence. Gabang, this is the photo of gabang. It's a musical instrument consisting of a series of bamboo bars. In my research, I assume it has been influenced or taken from dabang, which means hit the bang, or Chinese musical instrument made of wood. Suling, also flute, we call it suling, must have been borrowed from fengling or wind chimes. And this is also famous legacy in Sulu. We call it maligay. This is a house shape. As you can see, the design is very Chinese. This is usually filled with food and money, being constructed only at two occasions. When one finishes his Quran studies, Quran is the holy book of Islam, so there is some kind of a celebration. And maligay is the highlight of that celebration. The other occasion is marriage. Usually part of the demands of the bride's family, that includes the maligay. And today, in many municipalities and even the province of Sulu and Tawi-Tawi, especially during Province Day, there's always a contest, a maligay exhibit. In terms of dining pleasure, these legacies are also shared with other people in the country, especially the Tagalog. Words like pitsay, kangkong, miswa, pansit, bihon, tauyu, soy sauce, tausi, the fermented soybeans, bitsin, mistang, tungkang, matsakaw. Matsakaw was my favorite snack when I was a kid. It's very famous. And there are many places named after Chinese or named by Chinese. For example, is Holo, from the word Holang, or good people. Talipao is a municipality at the heart of Sulu. Accordingly, it was named after a couple who conducted their marriage in the mountain of Talipao. The couple was named Tali and Pao, so is the name Talipao came to be. Tanjung, a famous beach, must have been derived from the two Chinese words Tan and Zong. Siit, this is a famous heart-shaped lake in Sulu. Must have been from Sin-i, or the hearts. Siasi is famous because there have been lots of Chinese. The late Sambaltan, Sambaltan is actually from Siasi. Accordingly, must have been named after a trader, Siasi. Tiamik is an old market that still exists until today. It's called Tiamik Street or Tiamik Market, named after a famous Chinese trader in Sulu, Tiamik. Sindang, Bhutan. Bhutan is a wealthy female Chinese businesswoman in Sulu. She has a huge property and real estate named Bhutan. So today, Bhutan is a small community. Bungao, the capital town of Tawi-Tawi, must have derived from Bong and Tao, a dreamhead. Other legacies, Kuntao, the famous Taos of martial arts, must have coined from two words, Kung Fu and Taoism, because Taosug Kuntao also incorporates spirituality, especially the breathing skills and techniques. People in Sulu are usually called Taosu. In my assumption, the word Tao, Taosug, Sug is the place, Tao is people. So when we say Taosu, people of Sug, I was assuming that the word Tao, which is also being shared by the Tagalog, Tao, must have been taken from Taoism, meaning the way. In Sulu spirituality, an individual or human being is both the way and the goal so far as knowing God is concerned, because human being is the greatest manifestation of God. So it could be also an influence from Taoism. A deeper study on Chinese would reveal that spirituality, especially the breathing techniques for immortality, has also been taught and learned by the Taosu in Sulu. This is a very good discussion. I have provided some informations in my paper, particularly the practice of immortality and many other techniques of the breathing exercise. Okay, so my conclusion is that the history of Lannang is an evidence or manifestation of a possible partnership that usually result into mutual benefits that could lead into the establishment of a strong empire like the Sulu in the past, because Sulu Empire was not accomplished by the Tausug themselves. It was a collaboration of all people within who found home and sense of connection in Sulu. These were the Sama, the Muslims, the Arabs, Persians, Indians, as well as the Chinese. If there is mutual understanding, because the history of the Chinese in Sulu shows that there was both respect and understanding and tolerance. That is why Chinese in Sulu were not, for example, forced to convert to Islam. Many of them converted to Islam of their own, but they were not forced to convert to Islam. So a tolerant society like Sulu, which became a home of various people, and with people coming together to work together for the progress of the community they live, result into what we have known in the past as the Sulu Empire. Thank you. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Professor Absari. May I now call on Dr. Juvanni Caballero for his comments?
Hi, assalamu alaikum, my brother in Islam,
Hey.
Professor Darwin.
Peace be with you also.
Firstly, I'd like to congratulate Professor Absari for coming up with this paper. This is certainly a contribution to the furtherance of knowledge, especially for Mindanao. I am very glad to note that a native Mindanaoan, a Tausug in particular, wrote about his native land. We Mindanaoans have been accused of being good only at complaining about outsiders and non-Mindanaoans writing about Mindanao history. And for quite some time, this accusation was not baseless at all. We had the tendency to criticize and accuse writers from Manila and other countries of misinterpreting our history, society, and culture. Yet, we do nothing to contribute to the filling in of knowledge gaps. No? So Professor Absari is certainly among the young scholars from the southern part of this country who are involved in positively changing the landscape of scholarship. in the southern Philippines. And for that, I am congratulating you, Professor Absari.
Thank you so much.
Nonetheless, I have several observations that I think would make your paper even better. Like, for instance, I find the words shaping of Tausug civilization in the abstract very overwhelming and sweeping. I do not know if you see what I see, but personally to me, that statement is suggestive of a very delicate idea that Tausug civilization, as if all aspects of it is shaped by the Chinese. Are we suggesting that the Tausug culture or civilization, as you mentioned, was nothing but a consequence only of Chinese civilization? Is there nothing original in it or indigenous in it? So yun ang dating sa akin when you said how the Chinese shaped Tausug civilization. So parang napaka overwhelming nung dating ng statement na yun sa akin. And if you agree with me that such is contentious, then perhaps you may consider replacing it with words that are probably more acceptable or more politically correct. So yun. The second point is that, and I think these are very minor, Prof. There is a photo in your paper that is captioned "Tubig Laya."
Yes.
But your discussion says "Tubig Siangkap." So I really don't know what the exact name of the well is. Me reading the manuscript that was sent to me. Sabi ko, ano kaya rito, Tubig Laya or is this Tubig Siangkap? The pages of the paper that was sent to me seemed in this array, so I also don't know the exact page of the paragraph in your copy. But anyway, it is the paragraph after the paragraph that contains footnote number 5. Third observation is that I also noticed that there is a photo, probably that of Albert Kwok.
Yeah.
But the caption of the photo simply says "photo taken from Wikipedia." So probably the caption should probably say, this is Albert Kwok. Again, this is probably minor, but we cannot ignore minor glitches, especially when these are very glaring. Another minor matter is on the consistency of the format of your references, especially those sources from the internet. Some indicated the date of its access, while others did not indicate, or was not indicated. On the list of your key informants, I would also suggest that a brief description of the key informants, of your key informants, be included. After all, we wouldn't know who this certain Sulumuntan or Dato Faisal Zulkarnain or Bianting Lim are. So we really don't have any idea. Baka
You memorize all those names I wrote. Thank you.
I read your paper, Prof, so that's why I mentioned them here because they didn't have any description whatsoever. So I had no clue who these people are. But they must. I know that they must be very knowledgeable of the subject matter to qualify them of becoming your key informant. So I'm suggesting that you include just a brief description of that. Very basic. The first sentence in your conclusion, I think, needs more qualification. Like I do not know if you noticed it, but there is that. Part of your first sentence that says bitter social transformation. What's the context of this? And I'm pointing this out because we researchers who are probably very familiar and can be considered already an expert on the subject matter that we are writing on. Sometimes we have the tendency to assume that our readers also know what we thought of as common knowledge already. So I think that needs a little qualification, no? Bakit tinatawag mo siyang bitter social transformation, no? Yung paging parang torn between two yung sa let me see kung ano yung pagka-state, no? There. While Sulu is undergoing bitter social transformation as a consequence of the Tausug's long resistance against Western invaders on one hand and China's emergence as an economic giant in Asia on the other, their long peaceful interactions will provide an important lesson to reflect in contemporary time. To me, that needs qualification. Okay. The last but not the least, I see a little incongruence in the title and the body of the paper, especially that the paper claims to show Chinese contribution in shaping. Probably it's because of the word shaping Tausug civilization, Prof. No? Very strong messaging doon. To show Chinese contribution in shaping Tausug civilization. Take note that civilization has many dimensions and many criteria. And apparently these criteria were not even discussed and how the Chinese shaped these criteria in the context of Tausug civilization. What I am sensing, no, from the content of the paper is that it was actually simply discussing Chinese influences and or contributions to Tausug history, society, and culture. And so you may want to consider revising the title to encapsulate Chinese influences and contribution to certain aspects of Tausug history, society, and culture. Kasi if we are going to use civilization very specific yung rubrics ng yung criteria of civilization and how and if our claim is that Chinese shaped Tausug civilization, there is probably a need for us to discuss its criteria and how, especially show how Chinese shape this particular criterion of the Tausug civilization. So I think that's all. But overall, Prof, this is a wonderful contribution to the furtherance of knowledge, especially about understanding the southern part of the Philippines, particularly that of Sulu. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. Can I respond to Steph?
Later po, after nung two discussants.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Caballero. May I call on now the second discussant for this paper, Dr. Michael Tan.
Yes, thank you. Assalamualaikum to Professor Absari and our other Muslim brethren. I am wearing a mask, not because of virus, but the jacket of my tooth fell off. Bungal ako ngayon. It's the front tooth, and vanity dominates here. Let me get straight to the paper. I wanted to congratulate Professor Absari for this excellent paper on the Lannang Sug. It is it shows that there's so much yet that needs to be studied in terms of history here. And what we have here is both a historical demographic work and a cultural history. The aspect of historical demography is not very well developed yet, but especially for Mindanao. And I think this is why it's so valuable here, because we see here the emergence, the movement of people, which is spurred by trade, both international trade between China and the Philippines. But even more importantly, and this has been written up by, I think, Dutch researchers pointing out that the Chinese were able to penetrate inland trade in the Philippines. That's why when the Americans arrived, as Professor Absari pointed out, there was already the Chinese merchants dominated. No? And I'm using the word Chinese here a bit loosely, no? Because by that time, the Chinese in inland areas were pretty much absorbed. No? And this is my way also of partly answering Professor Caballero's questions. Nga. What we're seeing here is not just a Chinese influence in Sulu, but the impact of Sulu on the Chinese. No? My father's from Davao. No? And I grew up, my father often referred to Sulu and, well, to Sulu and Tawi-Tawi. And he said, there's so many Chinese there, but they've been completely absorbed in the population. No? They have become people of Sulu. No? And so this Lannang Sug is so very intriguing. I'm going to get back to that term in a while. The other demographic historical factors that we see here in the movement of people, which Professor Absari points out, is how persecution of the Chinese in Manila spurred Chinese there to go down to Jolo. No? And then another persecution in Jolo of the Chinese made them spread out to parang Maimbung and Buwal. No? So you see a double movement of population. And that needs to be captured better in historical accounts. No? And then there's a third one of the missionaries, but I don't think this was a mass movement. These were missionaries who would come here, so they did not come in big groups. But I was so very intrigued, Professor Absari, that the term Lanang Hui Hui is applied to them, referring to the fact that they're actually national minorities in China, Muslim minorities, the Hui, and the fact that they brought Islam as well to the Philippines. But there's a little footnote here which I think is very significant because they were Sufi Muslims, right?
Yes.
And I'm very intrigued by that. I hope you'll elaborate on that. Like you said, that there's a tree there, Kahoy Sina, a Chinese tree, to commemorate the missionary came who meditated under the tree. That is very Sufi, And of course, we know the Philippines is not Sufi, but I am just so intrigued there. Did it influence our music later on? And so it's another tradition that needs to be looked at. And I think it reflects the Tausug and Sulu as being very tolerant, right? Very accepting of different peoples and different variations of Islam. Eventually, of course, Sufi had practically no influence. I might be wrong there, but we have the others coming up. Now, the other aspect that you made very well here is the cultural history. These are the interactions of the Chinese and the Tausug nga, And this is the first time I've heard the term Lanang Sug. And if I might inform the audience, until I read Professor Absari's paper, my idea of the Lannang was a term very specific. You're correct in saying it meant our people, but it was very specific to the Hokkien, the people who came from the province of Fujian. The Hokkien are very, very parochial. It's like our people. I tell you, if this is a magic phrase in Chinatown, if you go there, if you ask someone Lannang, you're actually asking, are you one of us? And if the person says yes, and the person hears you saying, are you Lannang? The price will go down right away. It's a way of saying, we are one people, ibaba mo naman ang presyo. But now to hear of the Lannang Sug, I think in the context of Sulu, many are Hokkien, but from your linguistic analysis, there are terms there which are probably not Hokkien, which suggests that the Chinese who ended up in Sulu are probably from other areas. But the term Lannang is now used generically there. And I like the idea of the Lannang as not just being the Hokkien, but I'm in fact using the term Lannang now to refer to Chinese in the Philippines. And we need more Lannang studies. And inadvertently, maybe, Dr. Absari, you have contributed to Lannang studies. And then there's so many other aspects here, the deification of Pei Xian, the admiral from Zhenghosen. That's also very interesting that temples were erected to him. Actually, for the admiral himself, he did get temples. The artisan well, there are also vignettes that are good to know. Then, of course, you had your linguistic analysis. This one, I think, will need to be worked on some more because it's really very complicated because there are other languages there. And I hope that you'll be able to, like I was looking at the grave site and I was enlarging it, looking for any Chinese characters, and I could not find any because that would have helped me to figure out Pepe Shen and how his name got transformed. Maybe later on, I will get your address and we can communicate on that, on how we might be able to track down his Chinese name as well as all the other Chinese terms that you use. No, you did have the Chinese words for the others, and that's great. Teresita Ang See has something about Pun Tao Kong is not the name of, later no, we will read Tessie Ang See's comment here. No? But the best part, I don't know if you were aware of it, you know what I love about histories, no? And many people do not give it adequate attention. When we talk about people migrating and intermarrying, we forget that behind this, no, one of the most important historical demographic factors is people fall in love. Okay, and you had two love stories in there. This Pepe Shen, no, why did he stay on? It seemed that he fell in love. That's why he stayed on. And the other one, which really touched me, was the I'm looking for his name right now, Lieutenant Imao, no, who fought against the Japanese. No? He was killed by the Japanese, and his wife, who was a Chinese mestiza, threw herself on him and was executed by the Japanese as well. No? And that is something we forget, no? That the Philippines, the Principalia class in Manila, Central Luzon, Jose Rizal's family, this was the product of Chinese who came to the Philippines and decided to stay on and married local women. That is what migration and assimilation is all about. And Tausug has its share of many, many wonderful stories there that are waiting to be unearthed. And maybe that's what makes Holo a place of good people, no? The Holang. Incidentally, we may have to do a bit more work on the law. No, what I'm not sure. I checked quickly. Law is not quite community, but that's okay with me. I like the idea of the Holang because my father also used the term. No? He said the people of Holo are Holang. They're good people, no? As you described. You could feel very safe there. No? And I had a classmate who was from there. I visited Holo when I was very, very young. No? At that time, there was no fear, you didn't have what you have today. No? My father had no problems that I flew to Holo. I was very, very young then. No? I had a classmate as well in college from Marian Mumbing. I don't know if you know the family name, also from there. You could tell she was Chinese mestiza as well. No? So again, congratulations. I hope you will work on this and that eventually will be published. Maybe Ateneo's Confucius Institute should go a step further and have this printed. It is a real contribution to local history and to demographic history. Maraming salamat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tan. Now, Professor Absari, do you have something to say?
Just a quick reaction to the word shaping. I think I wrote there, contributed to the shaping, because as we know, much of our attention is focused on the contributions of the Muslim preachers. It is as if there was no interesting going on in the past before the arrival of the Muslim preachers. So I decided to write and use the word contribution to the shaping because Holo or Sulu, the Tausug people interacted with various civilizations, the Indians, the Chinese, and the third layer of interaction came with their interaction with the Muslims, which has impacted so much on the way of life of the Tausug. It's not like Chinese shaping the Tausug civilization. It's just one part. I mean, they have contributed to the rise and the elevation of the existing values and understanding in terms of religion and spirituality. And then, but those were legitimate observations, which I took note and hope to integrate. And also, I felt a little bit challenged as well as encouraged by the comments of our former chancellor, Michael Tan, Dr. Michael Tan. And I also took note of it, and hopefully I could explore more on the things that you mentioned that is worthy of more and deeper research. Thank you so much again, Sir Michael Tan, and also my brother Giovanni. Thank you so much for those wonderful comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Absari, Dr. Michael Tan, and Dr. Caballero. So for the next paper, our next speaker is Dr. Anthony Neri, Dr. Lee Anthony Neri. He submitted the proposal for this research project. However, due to the pandemic, could not work on it. So we are giving him 10 minutes to present his proposal, his insights on the topic, and how he intends to finish the research when it is already possible to do his archaeological work. So again, Dr. Lee Anthony Neri is an associate professor and currently deputy director, program secretary at the Archaeological Studies Program, University of the Philippines, Diliman. He was the former president of the Kapisanan ng mga Archaeologists sa Pilipinas Incorporated, a professional guild of archaeologists in the Philippines. Let's now welcome Dr. Lee Anthony Neri.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you again, Ms. Steph, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll be presenting an update and not yet the final paper of the project, which is entitled "The Archaeology of the Lanao Region." And then, because this project is a subcomponent of the general project, which is entitled "Probing the Maranao-Chinese Relation Before 1898." Actually, this paper, this presentation was already presented in September last year, 2021. But for everyone's information, I would like to present again the archaeology of the area and our plans for 2022. So before anything else, let me briefly discuss the political geography of Lanao. Now, Lanao region is, this is the map of Mindanao. As you can see on the upper left, Lanao region is located before Zamboanga Peninsula. And the region is composed of two provinces. We have Lanao del Norte, which is located on the northern part, composed of 22 municipalities and one city, which is Iligan City, and the capital is Tubod. And majority of these municipalities are all located along the coastal area of Iligan Bay. On the south is Lanao del Sur. We have Lanao del Sur is composed of 39 municipalities and one city, which is the capital, Marawi. And luckily, Lanao Lake is located in this province. And we know for a fact that Lanao Lake is the biggest lake in Mindanao and second largest lake in the Philippines, and also considered as one of the ancient lakes in the world. Now, previous archaeological study conducted in Lanao area are very scanty. We have the works of Professor Otley Bayer before the war in 1928. And after the war, we have the National Museum, the report of the National Museum, which was conducted in 1968. And most recently was from the University of the Philippines Archaeological Studies Program in 2015. Now, Professor Bayer in his book, which is entitled The Outline Review of the Philippine Archaeology by Islands and Provinces, which was published in 1947, presented two types of ceramics identified in Lanao. The first one is the blue and white Chinese porcelain, and the second one is the Sawangkalok ceramic, which is from Thailand. And both of these ceramics has been dated around 13th to 16th century. And mind you, that these ceramics were just presented to Bayer, and was just presented to him, and no exact provenance has been identified. And we have here, after the war, is the report of the National Museum of the Philippines, which was the report was dated in 1968. I think this project was headed by Jesus Peralta. Jesus, if I'm not mistaken, from the National Museum, yeah, Jesus Peralta. He was the Director 3 of the National Museum before he retired in 1997. And this project was in coordination with the Marawi State University, with the NSU, and they tried to identify archaeological sites along the western and eastern side of Lanao Lake. And based on their archaeological survey, they were able to identify cave sites in the eastern side, which is in the municipality of Malundo and Bubong. And these municipalities are located between the boundary of Lanao del Sur and the province of Bukidnon. So aside from the archaeological survey, they also did an ethnographic study of the area, especially in Marawi. They identified Turugan. We know for a fact that Turugan is a resting place for the traditional houses built by the Maranaos, and the Turugan were identified in the barangays of Bacolod, Chico, and in Marantao, in the city of Marawi. And also, aside from Turugan, a brassware industry was also recorded in the municipality of Tugaya in Lanao del Sur. As I mentioned earlier, the most recent archaeological survey was conducted by University of the Philippines Archaeological Studies Program, and this was conducted in the municipality of Kauswagan. This was an archaeological impact assessment with the GN Power Kauswagan to address the Mindanao grid power shortage in the area. And based on the archaeological survey and exploration, they were able to identify a number of earthenware sherds with some with incised and impressed design found along the coastal area of Lanao del Norte. So based on the morphology and the design of this earthenware, they have a very close similarities with the Sawang Kalanay pottery tradition. And we know for a fact that this type of tradition has been dating to the Metal Age period from 500 BC to AD 900. Now, okay, based on the previous report, this is the initial assessment of the archaeology of the region. Number one is that previous studies in Lanao region are very scanty, and no extensive archaeological reports and interpretations were presented. Thus, few exploration and no discussion of recovered archaeological materials. Number two is Lanao has a potential for archaeology because of its rich historical accounts, strategic geographic location, and geological limestone formation. And we know that this type of limestone formation are where caves are located. And we know in prehistory, caves are usually used for shelter, religious and ceremonial purposes. So the eastern side of the Lake Lanao, particularly in the municipality of Bubong, they have a potential of Pleistocene deposit because of its geological outcrop. And number four, we have the blue and white ceramics identified by Professor Bayer, definitely would indicate Chinese presence or Chinese commercial activities before 1800s. Last one is the earthenware sherds found along the coastal area in Lanao del Norte may attest to the antiquity of the region. The impressed and incised elemental designs of these materials may be associated with the Sawing Kalanay pottery tradition dating around the Metal Age period. And this type of tradition is commonly found in islands of Southeast Asia, indicative of early human mobility in the region. Okay, now here are the challenges encountered in the implementation of the archaeological research last year for 2021. Number one is pandemic. Actually, not just last year, but also including this year. Pandemic because of pandemic, we have limited access to archaeological resources. We have access to the report, access especially to the artifacts from the National Museum, and interview with people. And because of pandemic, it limits the mobility of the team because of its travel restrictions. We have restrictions from UP Diliman, from the IATF, and then from the different LGUs in Lanao del Norte and Lanao del Sur. The second one is the archaeological permit. Archaeological permit recently, I think that's last year. Last year, the regulation division of the National Museum has been transferred to the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. which means all issuance of archaeological permit must be secured from the NCCA and not from the National Museum anymore. So just last month, January of this year, we received a new set of requirements from the NCCA. So probably by next week, I'll be submitting a requirements for this Lanao project. And the third one is safety and security. We know for a fact that the archaeological survey will be conducted in the Lanao region. And number 4 is the mental sanity. That was last year for 2021, and we had a surge brought by this Delta variant. Okay. Now, future plans for archaeological project in 2022. So as I mentioned earlier, by next week, I'll be starting to submit the requirements for this project to the NCCA. And if everything goes well in our COVID health restrictions and quarantine period, in the second quarter of 2022, we could start the archaeological survey along the coastal area of Lanao in the months of May and June. And based on archaeological survey, if we find potential sites that needs further investigation, we could go back to Lanao in October for archaeological excavation. And I hope that this is timely with our submission for a final report in December 2022. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neri. Okay, so we will now proceed to the next presenter. The next paper is authored by Dr. Liang Guanghan, or Cynthia Liang. Is a PhD of he got a PhD of management and is the Chinese director of Confucius Institute at Ateneo de Manila University. She's also an associate professor at Sun Yat-sen University, Guangzhou, and a distinguished professor at Nanjing Communication University and Qingdao University. She is also advisor of Masters in Teaching Chinese and as a foreign language program under Ateneo's Department of Curriculum, Pedagogy, and Assessment. She was a research scholar of Media Lab, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US. For the discussants of this paper, Dr. Bao Maohong is a professor in the Department of History, Peking University in China, and director of the Center for World Environment History of Peking University. He received his PhD in World History from Peking University. His area of specialization are Philippine History Studies, Environmental History, and Asia-Pacific History. The second discussant is Jaime A. Flor Cruz, is a veteran China watcher and foreign correspondent in China. He was CNN's Beijing Bureau Chief and corresponded from 2001 to 2014. He served as Time Magazine's Beijing Bureau Chief and corresponded from 1982 to 2000, and Newsweek's Beijing reporter in 1981. He's a adjunct office professor at Peking University and a lecturer at the University of the Philippines. He is a chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Asian Center for Journalism at the Ateneo de Manila University and a board member of Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University. Now let us welcome Dr. Liang Guanghan for her presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Stephanie. Good afternoon to all. This is a study lasting for years. Since March 2016, the Ateneo Confucius Institute has been working on a documentary film, Sulu and China. Since I'm the director and also chief scriptwriter of the film, I worked with the crew to interview and shoot during almost the whole filmmaking. Since then, I also have been working on the research in this field. We interviewed hundreds of people from both the Philippines and China, also one from Japan. This study is based on field trip and online field trip also from the perspectives of anthropology, sociology, communication, and history science. This paper comprehensively uses a variety of research methods, such as observation, oral history, and also uses multiple symbols such as vision and text to observe and study the Chinese descendants of Sulu Sudan, a typical Chinese Filipino community. On one hand, It reviews the history of cultural exchange between China and the Philippines that has lasted for more than 1,000 years, provides further references for the diplomatic history of China and the Philippines. On the other, we should think about the harmonious coexistence of multiple cultures in the context of today's multiple dimension changes, and to seek a typical paradigm for the most essential problem of people, the topic of the culture homogeneity and identity in the current global communication process, and explore solutions for cross-cultural communication for international context. This study starts with a history of 600 years ago. As you know, after the Sulu Sultan was buried in Dezhou, his second and third son and his wife stayed in China. The second son and also the third son married a Chinese Muslim, creating a thriving Muslim community at Beiying village, Dezhou city in Shandong province. Sparsely populated as they may be, these descendants are identified by two surnames, An and Wen, with population of nearly 5,000 today. These facts and figures create a vivid mosaic of China-Philippines relations, which is fascinating enough to challenge our imagination. What experiences do these descendants have in the history? What kind of identity transformation do they experience? This paper will focus on the following research questions. First, what is their living situation and the spatial distribution of ethnic culture, including, Second, what do they inherit? How? Third, what happened in the process of inheritance? Fourth, how do they see their identity? And what is the identity of self-identity? How do they see their self-identity? Since the Spring Festival in 2016 to the end of 2019, my team and me conducted the interviews in 6 provinces and 9 cities in China. A totally numbers of almost 100 in-depth responders were interviewed, including more than 50 descendants and their spouses and 2 imams, experts and business circles from 5 Chinese branches from the 16th generation to the 21st generation, 6 current students in the Philippines and their families, and a large number of ethnic groups. The age ranges from 4 years old to 89 years old. Interview and follow up the work and life of some descendants involved in education, medical treatment, finance, arts, civil servants, animal and fishery, agriculture, businessmen, politicians, housewives, students, and other urban and rural industries. The main interview places are as following: Beijing, Shandong Dezhou, Tianjin, Jiangsu, Suzhou, Hebei, Cangzhou, Hebei Lianzhen, Liaoning Yingkou, Fujian Quanzhou, Guangxi Nanning. And in the Philippines, we also made our interviews in Manila, Davao, Zamboanga, Sulu, Darwin, and Laguyan. During my research, I found that China has unique and irreplaceable precious materials in field of Philippine-China relations. There is a serious lack of academic dialogue between Chinese and Philippine scholars in the history of Sulu King and the history of China-Philippine relations. The academic materials mastered by the 2 sides are not the same, sometimes are even conflict. The lack of language barriers and exchange opportunities makes it more difficult for academic exchange. It is difficult for the two sides to exchange what they need, and there are gaps and shortcomings in the research. As a Chinese director of Confucius Institute, which plays important role as a bridge between the two countries, and also a scholar at the meantime, I feel my research in the above areas forms a complement with the research in the Philippines in terms of academic values, and the two are irreplaceable. With this, in today's presentation, I will focus on two parts of my research. One is part of precious materials I found in Chinese. The other one is my research findings. Literature review include a batch of materials related to Sulu's contacts with China, includes Chinese and Philippine ancient books, folk culture relics such as a photo of Sulu Sultan's visit to Beijing, family heritage, gifts received by Chinese descendants during his visit to Sulu, etc. Documents, books, papers, genealogy, video materials, and other Chinese and foreign literatures. Relations between China and the Philippines, such like Philippine ancient book, Sulu history, and some other Chinese ancient books. Matsura Zhang's paper, he's a Japanese scholar, named History of China's Sulu Relations in the Ming and Qing Dynasty of Kansai University in Japan, was founded from one of my interviewers, which is difficult to obtain through normal channels. These literatures also includes research on Sulu Sultan's voyage to China and also research findings. Let me give a very brief introduction for the history of the Chinese descendants of Sulu Sultan. In 1405, Zheng He went to the west and passed Luzon Islands on his way. As a response and respect to China, in 1417, three Sulu Sultans, including the East King Paduka Batara, visited China, but unfortunately died of illnesses on October 22nd on his return trip. Emperor Yongle buried him in today's Dezhou as a royal family member. A monument was erected on November 11th, and the king's royal tomb was completed on November 21st. The second and the third sons of and also a wife of the Sulu king stayed in China to guard the tomb. Later, the two princes settled down in China and intermarried with Chinese Muslims, and finally formed a Muslim village that is today's Beiying in Dezhou City, Shandong province. In Qing Dynasty, the Emperor Yongzheng approved the descendants' request for Chinese citizenship, but they must give up the royal supply, agreed that the descendants become the residents of Dezhou and choose the pronunciation of Wen and An as their surnames. At present, there are about 5,000 Chinese descendants of King Sulu, covering 16 generations to 21st generation. They mainly lived in three religions: Beiying village, Changying in Beijing, Dezhou, and Dezhou is the largest settlement place, followed by Changying. Followed is the Changying village in Beijing. In addition, Tianjin, Suzhou, Jiangsu, Hebei, and Liaoning also have some branches. Yingkou in Liaoning province is a nearly discovered branch in recent years and has entered the genealogy. In addition to the above areas, Chinese descendants also have descendants scattered in the United States and Japan, but their relationship is very loose. The author also made contact with some of them. Through my research, I found that the economy status and social status of descendants vary from place to place. The reservation of religions, culture, and customs is different. Integration changes are great. Integration, culture, inheritance relations are different. And also identity differences or changes. In terms of education, occupation, and social economy status of descendants are those descendants from different regions show great differences in the above aspects. Among the descendants interviewed are farmers, mainly distributed in Changying, Dezhou, and Yingkou, Liaoning. Workers, as well as businessmen, media people, directors, financial persons, university professors, senior political officers, doctors, and other professionals. There are not only those who have not graduated from primary school, but also doctors who study abroad, among which there are many leaders in professional fields, such as the surgery doctor An Yang, who was a visiting scholar of Harvard University. The differences in occupation and also education lead to obvious differences in social economic status. My research for inheritance, conflicts, integration, and acculturation constitutes the phrases of cultural identity of the Philippine Chinese immigration ethnic group. During the integration with local cultures, the descendants of the Sulu Sultan have to face remarkable diverse realities. Villages like Beiying and Lianzhen are far from the city. As royal glamour disappearing without a trace, these villages become economic backwater. Their residents have slim chances of economic opportunities and also social mobility. In contrast, some descendants receive higher education as big cities such as Suzhou and Beijing, engaged in knowledge-intensive professional like professors, investors, and they change their destiny. This has led also to the internal contradiction attitude on the identity of the descendants on the basis of their identity of Chinese citizen. I describe it as to take man out of hometown or to take hometown from man. On the other hand, they watch the king's tomb and imagine their home motherland. On the other, they also go to the level of traditional identity in the process of purchasing self and mainstream integration. Their identity of descendants of King Sulu is much more about community identity and imagination of motherland. Although the Sulu blood is close to zero, the homeland imagination and ethnic ties make them still firmly recognize that they are the descendants of Sulu king or Filipino descendants. Among the Chinese descendants we visited, when answering the question about identity, they all express their dual identity. They are Filipino descendants and Chinese also. On this matter, there is basically no intergenerational difference. Meanwhile, while adhering to the identity of descendants of Muslims and imagining to the distant motherlands, the young generation has also made efforts to separate from the traditional identity in terms of occupation, lifestyle, and even living environments. The inheritance of the identity of Sulu descendants and royal descendants is the community history and mission handed down from generation to generation by Chinese families. The Dezhou is the most typical and complete in this regard. Descendants in Dezhou from 16 to 20 generation have expressed this oral family motto to the author: "Our ancestors are not Chinese. We are from the Philippines."
Hello, Dr. Liang. Dr. Liang, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Let's just wait for Dr. Liang to return to Zoom, maybe a few seconds. Hello, Dr. Liang.
Another and also Christian use God, like we can use logic to prove that this such brings the ontological argument, which is formulated by a Muslim but further popularized by brilliant
喂，梁老师。 老师能听到吗？
Try to speak louder.
Okay.
Ms. Stephanie, may I confirm if you can hear Dr. Liang?
Yes.
Yes, they can hear you louder.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to all. So I proceed now.
Yes, louder. You need to mute. Wait.
Is that okay now?
Yeah, it's okay now.
Sorry. The children's summer school, daily chanting, worship, and other ceremonies have been inherited and maintained in good condition, in very good condition. The Quran is also recited in Islamic language. As a special economic and cultural phenomenon, or in Arab, Niya, still widespread in this communication, in this community. With the development of social and technology, the form of Niya has greatly changed. For example, people use WeChat transfer and public accounts, and also collected money through the national descendants in WeChat group. But the essence remains be the same. The convener is still a respective family leader. Ethnic characteristics are also inherited in the family. Almost everyone will mention diligence, honesty, kindness, courage, and charity. Straightforward and other tutoring and discipline training. These characteristics of conduct recognized by the family not only enable the family to acquire the common traditional morality of the Chinese nation based on Confucian culture, but also show the unique temperament of descendants of Sulu king. After 600 years, this large family of royal descendants have also experienced the ruling and promotion of the historical will, cultural differences, and articulation. The contradiction and the impact between tradition and modernity and so on. These most common conflicts in today's world are concentrated in this immigration ethnic group. Compared with ordinary Chinese families, for this special descendant group, the cultural conflicts and adjustment between the immigrations and the mainstream and the variation and conflicts between generations are more prominent. Generally speaking, the tradition of descendants of Sulu king relatively complete and strict, especially in Beiying village, Dezhou,
where the tomb of Sulu King is located. However, in some areas, the younger generation, especially such as the 19th generation in Yingkou, have shown serious differences, especially for the young generation of elite classes. Their identity is more based on professional identity, which is obviously different from the ethnic and religious identity of their elders. For ethnic identity, there is a typical intergenerational tier. In order to resist the estrangements and conflicts with the mainstream society, descendants families generally adopt a way of active adjustment to adapt to the mainstream and modern society. For intra-clan and intra-religion intermarriage, there are still regulations on Muslim intermarriage, which has been a relatively closed and introverted family system for many years. In my research, it was found that traditional cooperations or the bottom of the society still strictly follows the marriage rules and regulations. However, among the descendants of the 3-year-old generation, there has been a clear easing trend. I used the concept of acculturation to describe the influence of the mainstream society on the identity cognition of the Chinese descendants of Sulu King, as well as their integration and reverse influence to the mainstream society. From various periods of history, the descendants of Sulu King have been looking for a way to integrate into the mainstream society after obtaining Chinese citizenship. In addition to Chinese names, marriage and occupation are important channels for integration into mainstream society or authority institutions. With the permission of Emperor Yongzheng, the second and third son of Sulu King used the pronunciation of their names to their surnames for their surnames, which made them have the same name as the Chinese people and no longer have to be distinguished from the generation public. They also hope to be recognized by the mainstream society or authority institutions through various ways of social life. At the core of the cultural circle, descendants obtain social identity by mobilizing social capital, such as establishing Muslim opera troops to increase exposure, fame, and social recognition, obtaining certificates from governments at all levels, becoming members of a village committee or deputies to the National People's Congress, or using very local language so as to become a part of the mainstream society. At the periphery of the cultural circle, traditional Muslim architecture and Chinese architecture style are integrated to form a unique architectural complex of descendants of Sulu King. The combined action of different cultural forms, occupations, society, technology, and other external factors such as architecture, language, and art also make families represented by Changying village in Dezhou, recognizing their ethnic identity and religious identity, realize the localization by improving their social economic status, and shape a unique cultural space integrated into the mainstream society and different also from the mainstream society. Meanwhile, conclusion, this study is dedicated to advocating the coexistence of cultural and identity pluralism. The researcher is fully convinced that only in this way can a world culture display a riot of color. Meanwhile, the researcher advocates equal respect for different cultures and identities and equal rights to have voices heard, just as the colorful nature world, where multiple species live together in peace, all life under heaven has its own unique significance and value. Therefore, when we talk about culture and identity, what we actually discuss is harmony coexistence of multiple culture and common and multiple identities, and the continuation of friendship between different ethnic groups. So this is the conclusion. Thank you for your attendance and patience for my sharing. Apologize for my bad internet again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liang. Now, may I call on Dr. Bao Maohong for his comments?
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I will express my thanks to Professor Bananka and Professor Liang for inviting me to join this conference online. Regretfully, I missed the opening ceremony and the panels in this morning because I was in journey at that time. Definitely, Professor Liang gave us a wonderful and inspiring presentation on the mini ethnic group and the descendants of Sulu Sultan in China. Based on archive research, fieldwork, and oral history, Professor Liang analyzed the change of identity of various branches of descendants of Sulu Sultan in different provinces and of different stratum or professions empirically. From the perspective of cultivation theory by Professor George Gebner, Professor Liang traced the history of cultural communication of China and the Philippines and prospected the future of these mini ethnic groups in the context of globalization, modernization, and digitalization. My suggestions or my remarks are as below. Firstly, as the main dynamic of the change of identity of Chinese descendants of Sulu Sultan, the evolution of politics and ethnic policy and religious policy in China should be emphasized further. Actually, as a centralized nation state, the ethnic and religious policy regulated the identity and behavior of ethnic groups in China to some extent. In other words, it promoted the assimilation and acculturation of ethnic groups in China. So this should be emphasized in your paper, in your presentation. Secondly, affected the root seeking of the Chinese descendants of Sulu Sultan. The change of rule of Sulu in the Philippines should be dealt with in your paper. As a specific ethnic group in the Philippines, Sulu played different roles in different times. For example, Sulu was sensitive when the separation happened in the southern Philippines. In 18th and 19th century, Sulu zone was an integral part of Southeast Asian maritime world. It was analyzed by Professor James Warren in his masterful book, The Sulu Zone. This book, The Sulu Zone. It is about the 18th and 19th century Sulu in the Southeast Asian maritime world. Definitely, all these differences were not helpful for Chinese descendants to recognize their ancestors in China. Certainly, what's the effects of television programming or media on the attitudes and behaviors of the Chinese descendants of the Sulu Sultan? In your paper, not in your presentation, you borrowed the cultivation theory by Professor George Gabner to analyze the effects of television programming on the attitudes and the behaviors of the Chinese descendants of Sulu Sultan. As I know, cultivation theory was summarized from the American experience. It is reasonable for you to adopt this theory. But however, what are the commonality and the contrast of cultivation in the US and China? In other words, based on your case study, what will you supplement or revise this theory, this cultivation theory by Professor George Gabner? All in all, I hope you will further historicize and contextualize the identity of this mini ethnic group when you revise your draft. I'm looking forward to reading your revised version sooner. That's all of my remark or discussion. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Bao.
谢谢包老师。
You're welcome.
Okay, may I now call on Mr. Jaime Flor Cruz for his comments? Sorry, Sir Jimmy, you're on mute po. Thank you. Still on mute po, sir. I'll try to prompt you po para to unmute.
Am I back? Am I?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to this Confucius event. Congratulations to Professor Liang for this. The topic is very close to my heart. In 1980, I've started to hear about the story of Sultan of Sulu and his descendants somewhere in Guangzhou, in Shandong, Dezhou. There were very scant information, but I got very curious and I wanted to go. But it turned out that Dezhou where the tumulus of Sultan of Sulu was. Dezhou was closed off from foreigners. It was Bukaifang. And so what should I do? So I figured out that if I could take a train from Beijing to Shanghai, so I bought a round trip ticket and then I got off in Dezhou, which was midway between the two cities. And then I rented a bicycle and asked around. And finally I found the place where this Sultan of Sulu was buried. It was still a very poor village, but I managed to find the picture. I take pictures of the place, and it was one of the most memorable trips, illegal trips that I've had taken in China at that time. I wish I had the chance that Professor Liang has had in researching more about the story of the descendants of the Sultan of Sulu. It's a valuable addition to the narrative of Philippine-China relations. It fills a void in this very positive chapter of the good relations that we've had. I mean, there's still many, I think there's still many holes to fill, gaps to fill in this interesting chapter of our relations. But it is a positive story of public diplomacy, of cultural exchange between our two countries. Of course, Professor Liang's research also has a wider significance in terms of, you know, the debate about cultural homogeneity versus, or cultural diversity versus the cultural hegemony. It's also, especially in this period of globalization and digitalization, I think this is a good study of cross-cultural exchanges, cross-cultural communications. It's a little-known story in the Philippines, and I think in China as well, that is crying to be told and retold. And I hope that Professor Liang can continue the approach of multidisciplinary research as well as multi-platform or multi-media approach in trying to dig up this story and flesh out the various stories contained in her research, and so that they can be accessible not only to the academics. Professor Bao already, I think, gave very valuable suggestions as to how Professor Liang can further enrich her story from the academic point of view. But I am just as interested in encouraging her to enrich her research so that it can be a valuable tool for public diplomacy, for promoting our people-to-people exchanges. Her research, to me, prompts some curious questions, like how much written records are available or have been kept, handed down to generations, if there are, and also how much of oral history has been done to, again, preserve the narrative, enrich, flesh out the stories, the people's stories that I'm sure are still out there. And also, I'm also curious, how did the descendants of the Sultan of Sulu cope during the difficult periods of China's history, like during the Cultural Revolution, when being a foreigner or having foreign connections was actually a crime or a political problem. I'm not sure if you have done some of that, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to dig into that, not because we want to dwell on negative stories, but I think it's part of the story of this descendants of Sulu, and will show how resilient and how, you know, strong they have been all these years. And I think that's part of the narrative, and that should be a source of pride for the descendants, and it should be a source of encouragement for the peoples in China as well as the peoples in the Philippines. Finally, I also wonder if there is some analogy or some historical parallels to the story of the descendants of Sulu and to the diaspora, the descendants of the Jewish community, who apparently lived in places like Henan. Not that it should be a focus of the research, but I wonder if there's any analogy that can be made as to how the two diasporas survive China's tumultuous, glorious history. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir Jimmy.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Okay, Dr. Liang, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, for Professor Bao's suggestion, I really appreciate because those kind of academic points are also what I should do in the future to enrich and revise my paper. And in today's presentation, most of my content is like description, not too much focus on the analysis. And I strongly agree to Professor Bao's suggestion that for some kind of factors that influence the change or recognition of the Chinese descendants' identity, I should do some more and further analysis in the future. And to respond for Sir Jamie, yeah, thank you so much for your encourage and your expectation for my future job. One of the questions just now you raised, I would like to raise a response also for the oral history, especially during some of the difficult times in the Chinese history, like the Cultural Revolution. I did also ask such kind of questions, and for those kind of very interested responses from the descendants, I hopefully in the next part, other part, for example, analyzing about the political actors or some other different actors influence the identities of the Chinese descendants. I should mention about those. Yeah, and I also very appreciated with Sir Jamie is not just for my academic work, but also for the cultural work relating to the Sulu China part, and also for the documentary or some other different part in the future. I really thank you for your encourage and supporting. Thank you so much. And yeah, I learned a lot from both of you, two professors, scholars. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liang. Thank you, Professor Bao. Thank you, Sir Jimmy. Now, this ends the afternoon session. Sophia?
Thank you so much, Ms. Steph, to our presenters and discussants for the afternoon session, and to all our participants who joined us in the presentation of the final papers of the Pre-Colonial and Colonial Philippines-China Relations History Conference. To formally close the conference, let us welcome His Excellency Jose Santiago L. Santa Romana, Philippine Ambassador to China, and Dr. Liang Guanghan, Chinese Director of the Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University, for the closing remarks.
Dr. Ellen Palanca, Dr. Liang Guanghan, Dr. Ellen Palanca, Dr. Liang Guanghan,
Apologies for the technical error.
Dr. Ellen Palanca, Dr. Liang Guanghan, distinguished panelists and guests. Greetings from Beijing. A pleasant day to everyone. I thank the Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University for organizing this online conference and for giving me this opportunity to speak before this esteemed audience of academicians, researchers, and fellow history enthusiasts. I thank and congratulate the researchers and experts for sharing the outcome of their work with us today. As neighbors, interaction between the Filipino and Chinese people goes a long, long way back. It has ridden the waves of human history, leaving indelible marks on each other's collective experiences across time. I hope that all your work can contribute to efforts towards fostering a better and deeper understanding between the Philippines and China. History is the story that binds people together. It moves them, animates them, and brings them together for a higher purpose. For nations, it is the reason for being and an important element in building their own unique identity. However, I think that history will only ever be as powerful as the truth that it has to portray. We have heard time and again that we must learn from our past. This must be an even more formidable task for nations as they chart their own destinies into the future. Didn't Dr. Jose Rizal say, and I quote, "In order to read the destiny of a nation, it is necessary to open the book of its past." I hope that this conference would open up prospects for more research and conversations about history in the future. The range of interesting topics we had today shows that there is a lot to learn about the centuries-old relationship between the Filipino and Chinese people. I commend each and every one of you who made this gathering possible. On that note, let me thank you again for having me in this conference. I wish you all good health and more success.
Dr. Liang?
Yes, thank you. Dear Dr. Palanca, Director of Ateneo Confucius Institute, dear Honorable Ambassador Gito Romana, all authors and discussants, distinguished audience, good afternoon. Thanks a lot to Ambassador Gito Romana and also the President of Ateneo de Manila University, Father Yao. It's our big honor to have their always support to our institutes in all these years for each important event, even in their very busy schedules. Not only the ambassador and the president, most of the discussants of today are old friends of the institute and have been supporting us also. We appreciate you a lot. I would like to express my congratulations to this wonderful, meaningful, and important conference. We fortunately started this research before the pandemic, but we are more fortunate that even during the very severe situation, all of our researchers can still finish their research wonderfully so that we can hold these conferences successfully. Through this conference, we are able to have new precious information, knowledge, and materials about relations between the Philippines and China in pre-colonial and colonial era. I believe all these new outputs and papers promote the research in this field and also promotes understanding and friendship between our two people as well. With this, I would like to say congratulations and express my respect and thanks to all of our researchers, the 16 distinguished discussants, my co-director, Dr. Alan Planka, all my colleagues, and all who support and contribute their efforts to this conference. The conference is successfully done today, but it is not an end of the research in this field. On the contrary, we just start a wonderful journey to more fruitful academic results and more beautiful relations between our countries. The Ateneo Confucius Institute is cooperated by Ateneo and Sun Yat-sen University, Guangzhou. As Chinese director of the institute, I would also like to express the expectation from the Chinese side on behalf of Sun Yat-sen University. We sincerely hope that we have more and deeper cooperation, joint research projects, educational and cultural people-to-people exchange in the future. To all the researchers, we welcome your continuous research in the future and will do our best to support you. We also welcome you come to our institutes and even to China to find out more resources. Once again, congratulations and thanks a lot to all the researchers, discussants, all my colleagues, and the attendants. Salama, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Santa Romana and Dr. Liang, for the closing remarks. And before we formally conclude our afternoon session, we would like to request everyone to please turn on your cameras for our picture taking. Okay, I'll be taking few photos. Okay, while we're waiting for the others to turn their cameras on, let's take some now. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, I'll take another one. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Again, to all our presenters, discussants, and participants, thank you for joining the Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University for this conference.